Welcome to the 2015 Data Summit. This is becoming an increasingly important conversation in the community. Things that we have to think about in terms of data, how we use it, why we use it, and most importantly, how we use it responsibly. So those are some of the subjects that we're going to talk about today. It struck me when I was watching the commercials during the Super Bowl, the Esurance ads were all about data. Because Lindsay showed up because she fit the data, but she didn't fit the data. And I think it's really important that we think about how we use this data, not only responsibly, but in a way that makes sense and provides insights. And I'm really excited about the conversation we're going to have with Jonathan this morning on that subject. So with that, I want to turn it over to the architect of the day, and that would be Bill Tucker, who really put this thing together for us, and I'd like to welcome him to the stage.
I'd like to introduce Jonathan Nelson, who is Chief Executive Officer of Omnicom Digital. I had the pleasure of meeting Jonathan a few years ago, flying to Cannes, and it was just a fantastic conversation for me, and we're just thrilled that he's here today. Jonathan co-founded Organic, the first interactive agency, in 1993, and served as Organic's CEO for 7 years. Described as a serial entrepreneur, Jonathan has founded or played a critical role in building a number of companies. In 1999, Jonathan took 2 companies public, Accrue Software, a web measurement and analytics company that he founded in 1995, and later Organic. Jonathan is widely recognized as an industry thought leader, appearing in print in the New York Times, USA Today, Forbes, Newsweek, and Adweek, and on television, CNN, CNBC, and MSNBC. His numerous accolades include being named one of the top 100 young innovators of the century by MIT's Technology Review in 1999, and one of the top entrepreneurs of 1997 by Red Herring magazine. Jonathan was inducted into the Ad Age Hall of Fame in 2001 for his indelible imprint on the industry. Jonathan sits on numerous boards in the media and finance industry. He's passionate about music, is co-owner of 2 San Francisco venues, and co-produces San Francisco's Hardly Strictly Bluegrass annually in Golden Gate Park. Please welcome Jonathan Nelson.
Thank you.
Wow, Red Herring magazine.
I know. I did everything
Who
in the
remembers
90s.
that
Nothing's
magazine?
happened in 20 years.
Yeah, that's an old one. I remember back in my San Francisco days when we had all those magazines stacked up showing what it was like and how thick the magazines were. And you couldn't even buy space if you wanted to. Well, that's changed. Jonathan, one of the things we want to talk about this morning is your role as CEO of Omnicom Digital and the purview that you have. And certainly within the Omnicom group, you have the best of breed in so-called creative agencies and media agencies and digital agencies. So talk a little bit about your role and how you coordinate across all of those different kinds of disciplined agencies, if you will.
So my role is to look across all of the Omnicom assets. That's not to say at all that I run all of the Omnicom assets. That we have great managers in each of those companies. But kind of look across them and try to push digital where appropriate into each of the businesses and look at, okay, how is digital going to change our business, which obviously it is dramatically, and work with the management teams and specifically the digital teams to kind of get change to happen, which is always quite interesting. And when we have 250 or so different named brands across 5,000 offices and all the work that's ongoing. So I kind of look over all of that.
Having run several businesses that worked within holding companies, and anybody who knows my background knows that one of them was Omnicom, it's not always easy to coordinate when people have P&L on their mind. So how do you get over that? Because I think that's one of the trickiest parts of the business these days.
Well, there's lots of tricks. I mean, the not so dirty secret about our business is it's about people and it's about relationships. And I've been doing this for quite a while and developed relationships. You know, you and I have had a long time relationship. And I've had relationships with most of the management teams inside of Omnicom and many people throughout the industry. And so over time you develop trust and relationship, and it doesn't hurt that the wind is blowing in the digital direction. So as a person who tries to do change, you know, there's a lot of explanation, there's a lot of tools needed, there's a lot of relationship and trust, and you know, and finding great talent and pushing them into the business. And so that's a big part of what I'm doing.
So one of the things that we did this year was we launched an initiative with a new award, which is called the Partner Awards, which is really all about creativity and collaboration. And it really takes into account what I'd call the tripartite part of our business, which is agencies, clients, and then either publishers or platform relationships.
Sure.
And last September, you announced a really pretty significant relationship with Facebook and Atlas. Can you talk a little bit about that relationship, how it's going, any significant progress, and any results to date that you might talk about?
Sure. I'm trying to figure out what I can actually talk about. I guess it was, when was that, August or September?
September.
September, we announced a relationship with Facebook, specifically with the Atlas, the ad serving side of things. And we are taking some of their data, very anonymous data, which I want to make you know, it's scrubbed of true PII or personal information, but matching that with our databases that sit inside of Intellect to try to figure out, okay, how do we get smarter about putting the right message in front of the right person at the right time on the right device? Facebook is a great partner because they know who individuals are. You have to log in to use Facebook. It's generally actually you. You use your Facebook login to log into lots of other things like Netflix or Guilt or whatever you want to do. So they have incredible view of actual people across the internet, and they have persistence. We have worked very hard for the past several months to try to integrate it into our platforms. We've done that. And so we're just starting to see actual persistence. People, we know, okay, someone logged in on their mobile phone here, and they logged in on their desktop computer here. And that level of persistence, I think, allows us to do better marketing because, in my opinion, I mean, most marketing is kind of spray and pray. It's really relatively untargeted. If I bought a car yesterday, chances are I'll see the same number of car ads today as I saw yesterday because, everybody treats me like a new customer. What we're trying to do is figure out, okay, what is the right message? What's the right message to a potential future customer? What's the right message to an existing customer? What's the right sequence of messages? What's the right sequence at what time, across what device? What's the right narrative cadence? So you probably, if you just bought a car, you probably want to see how the transaction went, but you might want the car company to go dark for 6 months or so. But over time, you want them to come back and help manage your car ownership process, and then as your lease comes up or as you want to get a new car, obviously the cadence of communication should increase. Facebook, I think, and the unique idea that persistence will help us do that. It'll help make us smarter and put more relevant advertising in front of people. It's early days, but we're starting to do that.
Well, I'm glad you brought up the non-PI part of the information because
hugely important.
As you know, we've been very, very involved in all the privacy issues, and actually I can remember going back 5 or 6 years ago when I first got to the 4A's, somebody saying to me, listen, you guys need to get your shit together with regard to digital, because if you don't...
I think that was me.
I think it was you and several other people who summoned me into a room and told me to get our shit together. But it's been an incredibly intense 6 years of work on that front, and I think for all of us as a community, it's really important to make sure that we act responsibly with that regard. And I think Facebook's been a good partner to the industry on that front.
Yeah, I think we're evolving. I think we're getting better. I mean, I'm not one of these people that says absolutely anonymous advertising. I mean, if I have a relationship with a brand and I trust them to maybe buy a car or, financial a bank, right? I want them to know something about me because I want them to help me manage my relationship. On the other hand, if I don't know who the person is, I don't entirely want them to know, I don't want them to get too eerily close to me. And so I think that there's, we have to be very structured about how we do this and be very concerned about this. And as an industry, there are different standards in different places. I mean, what you can do in the US is very different from what you can do in a place like Germany. And we inside the Omnicom world are very cognizant of this and trying very hard to figure out what are the structured standards, what's appropriate.
Well, I don't want to go too far off on this, but we just announced a joint venture, not venture, but a partnership with the IAB and ANA on trustworthy accounting within the ecosystem. And it's going to be, Bob and Randall and I joke that, it's going to be us against the Russian mafia, and that we're going to need to hire bodyguards. But it is something that's really important to the chain, the supply chain, is the trustworthiness of the advertising. Yeah,
and I think I applaud that. I think, as I've said privately and publicly, I guess, as an industry, we have to lead.
Yes.
We have to show standards. We have to agree to them. We have to not be spooky and eerie and freak people out. We have to present value. And I think this is a big part of doing exactly that.
I want to talk a little bit now about data and insights and ideas, because I know Omnicom stresses that it's not just about the data, but it is about leading to great strategy. So can you talk a little bit about how your approach may be different from other people's?
Well, I think data is less than worthless by itself. It's very, very expensive to collect, to maintain, to scrub and make sure that it's appropriate and accurate. It's very hard to connect it on all the technical sides to make it actually work. I mean, it really comes down to people. And I think it's been interesting. I've been doing data. I did a startup in the mid-90s that was a data, kind of what would now be called big data startup, and been working with this for quite a while. And the reality is without a person there, the insight doesn't really happen. And so connecting all this big data and all these giant systems to a person, to an analyst who actually makes an insight, who changes something, and ultimately it shows up either on the screen in television or in print or whatever. Insights happen across all the different communication touch points. I think that's the key component. I've seen the pendulum swing a little bit far to the geekdom side of this.
Yeah.
Black boxes are really cool. They're fun to program, but that's not entirely what this is about. In fact, I think it's swung too far. We have almost too much data when we don't have enough insight. And so bringing that people side of this back in is huge.
I think that's really important. We quite regularly will have clients come in and address certain parts of our community. And about a month ago, we had Beth Comstock from GE in to talk to the Media Leadership Council. And one of the things she was talking about was the fact that she feels like there's a lack of leadership with regard to strategy and insights, and that she's begging her agencies for that on a regular basis. What can agencies be doing to make sure they're providing the right kind of insights to their clients?
Well, I think that the nature of the type of person that's sitting inside of agencies is changing. You're seeing much more of the quant side of things come to the forefront. I think it's very complex to mix sort of art and science, right? Put a quant person next to a creative director. I mean, one person has to translate all these numbers into an insight, and a creative director often has to pick the absolute perfect image and copy and audio and all that, and bring, somehow making that work and do it consistently, and as we're seeing, having it fracture into a million different communication touch points and orchestrate all that. It's complex stuff, but it takes great people. It takes an organization that has that as a mission. It takes training. It takes experimentation. And it takes a lot of failure, to be honest. You got to learn from your mistakes as you're doing this.
And do you think that creative directors have gotten more accepting of data driving the insights into what they're doing? I mean, you work at a creative agency like I did, growing up in the business, and those guys would look at you like you were foreign if you showed up at the doorway with big data.
Yeah, I remember, this was like in 1995, 96. I just founded a company, Organic, digital company, and I got brought in by a very famous advertising agency that was doing Nike, and I was brought in as the digital guy to do Nike.com, very first time that it had been done. And I got paired up with a creative director who I didn't. I come from a San Francisco tech background. And the guy looked at me, he's like, well, I don't even know why I should talk to you. Like, I'm not going to win a Clio with your stuff. Like, what's the point of this? And I kept showing him, like, data and how we do this, and he just didn't understand. And I think we've come a huge way since then, that creative directors now, I don't know that it's entirely their job to be the left brain analytics person, but partnering with them in the same way that Birnbach took a art director and a copywriter and put them together. I think you're now seeing a planner or a analyst planner. It's gone from a two-way thing to a three-way thing. Creative, strategy or planning strategy analyst and, copy, all fitting together.
And how are you finding those people? Because that's one of the things I'm hearing from every agency of every size and kind in terms of trying to find that talent.
Oh gosh, you just beat the bushes. And, fortunately, there's a whole world of folks that are either they're coming up on the sell side of media. There's a lot of folks that are analytically trained on that side of the house. There's, lots of people graduating from universities. There's a lot of very smart people who are changing and adapting and evolving. Ultimately, data is often in the details, but it's not that crazy hard to pull out insights. There's so much stuff sitting there. It's so available. So we do a lot of training. We hire from all over the place.
Are you looking at people with economics backgrounds? Tell me a little bit about the difference.
All over the place. We hired a guy from NASA recently. We hire quant people from down on Wall Street. We hire people with economics backgrounds and statistics, degrees in statistics. But that's the obvious stuff. The key is to find someone that has a balance between the right and the left brain that kind of gets. It goes both ways, right? A lot of times geeks are so dweebed out that they don't know how to translate what they're saying into anything that's actually relevant. And likewise, creative directors oftentimes, they think, oh my God, that's the perfect shade of blue, right? Well, blue's not a number. Well, I guess it can be represented as a number, but it's pretty hard to account for taste. So it's the quant and the qual coming together. And so you try to find people with an aptitude, or at least the communication skills to relate to the other side.
So do you think that moving forward, we're going to see more and more acquisitions by the holding companies for big data companies? I'm not going to ask you specifically to name anything with Omnicom, but...
Yeah. Well, I think you almost need to parse the question a little bit. There's data and what you do with it. And then there are tools companies, and then there is data itself. And I know that a couple other holding companies have gone and bought true data companies where they sell data. And in many cases, we love that because we buy data, and we buy data from some of those companies. On the other hand, there are these tools companies out there that manage big data. Google is a great example. And once again, I don't think you need to own them in order to use them. In fact, our strategy has been open source. We do what we call surf the innovation curve. We think that the Valley and Boston, New York, there's so much venture capital and smart people going into that space that we go, okay, if we need a social media listening tool, we'll look across the landscape. There's literally 100 of them. We'll evaluate them. We'll pick the best one. What we really want to do is have the services layer and figure out that what I just mentioned, the quant, qual, how do you put the analyst with the creative director? What's the right communication? Because that is really, really hard. And personally, I think you can get very distracted trying to build tools companies or buying, raw data companies. I want to focus on what we are good at. And, we got our hands full just trying to figure out how to do change inside, an 80,000 person organization, just focused on the person side of it.
I love the phrase surfing the innovation because I think that's a really interesting approach. Can you talk a little bit about the innovations that we should all be paying attention to right now?
Wow. I don't know, I mean, a couple really basic things about digital that are really obvious. Everything in digital is by nature addressable and accountable. And so, ergo, data, right? People become very, very obsessed with software and hardware and all of those things. I think that is all true. What's most interesting is how people use this stuff and kind of, as new things come out, what are the use cases? And so right now I'm pretty fascinated, you know, almost everybody has a television in their pocket right now. You know, cell phones, you know, became smartphones. We're still dealing with the reverberations of that, and you're just seeing the first glimmers of true online video going mass and going global, which is a huge phenomenon. I mean, that's at the core. You know, it's 50% of media budgets or television, right? You know, no big insight here, but it's all shifting across. I think in the meantime, there's a very interesting epiphany that I had at CES. I've been going to CES since I was 14 years old. I know it sounds weird, but I grew up in Wisconsin. CES was in Chicago. I was a big stereo freak. I used to go there all the time and when I was a kid and just like walk around. And every year for, you know, I'm now 47, you know, it's been 30 years of watching televisions evolve. And I was out in Las Vegas and I realized that TVs have kind of stopped evolving for the first time. A very interesting thing, right? You saw 3D, you saw them getting bigger, you saw them getting thinner, you saw them go 4K. I mean, this was the first CES where TV's kind of like, I don't want to say TV's done, I'm not one of those people, but I'm saying the physical side of the TV. Yeah, it's probably going to get thinner, there'll be 8K, but you know, the idea is that it's networked, it's wall size, you know, everybody's got one, it's kind of done, right? What's replacing it, no news here, Internet of Things. And I think that has massive repercussions. You know, we're starting out with Nests, you know, thermostats and locks and Fitbits, you know, evolving into watches. But I think, I don't entirely even know where this goes. And I'm pretty excited that a whole new generation of electronics are evolving that are going to give us the chance to create better experiences for people. And by the way, connect marketing to utility and commerce, which I think is really where our industry starts to go.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. And you know, it's funny, my first job in advertising was CES. And when it was two shows, January and June. So
McCormick Center.
Yeah, I totally remember that. And we've been talking about actually, you know, having worked in San Francisco myself for many years, and Cisco being one of my clients, Internet of Things was something that they didn't coin that phrase, but they talked about it 20 years ago, and I used to go see demos of it at their campus. And I think that at that time, it was more about how they were going to penetrate the house, but nobody talked about it having utility or data embedded in what it is that they were doing. It was really more about being networked and selling equipment, of course.
Yeah, of course.
But now that we're talking about data that can be used across all of those different devices and the Internet of Things, how do we ensure that we're delivering that utility for consumers and still delivering on a marketing platform that allows us to sell things? Because that's ultimately what we want to do.
I think that the market sort of tells you oftentimes what's right. You know, clearly the iPhone is just a smash success. I mean, it was, and by the way, it wasn't obvious, I don't think. I mean, I got the first iPhone and I was like, by the way, we do Apple's advertising, so it should not, I mean, clearly it's, you know, they made $18 billion last quarter. But the first one wasn't that great. I mean, it didn't really work. And I had the Newton way back when, and that definitely didn't work. But the market validated it. You know, I think in terms of utility, there's a very close feedback mechanism of, you know, put out a marketing message, get some early adopters to use it, to review it. You know, word of mouth, of course, is huge in this room, I'm sure. You know right away when you're doing the right thing, and I think the harder thing is to realize, maybe your hopes and ambitions are outweighing reality when you're doing the wrong thing. So innovation and learning and trying to figure this out. And the kind of cool thing, going back to the CES analogy, like, I don't know where the Internet of Things really turns out. I just know it's going to be huge. And it's going to have so many different applications because, as crazy as it sounds, having an internet-connected, washing machine is actually a great idea. I mean, it makes a lot of sense to me.
You mentioned knowing when you're doing the right thing, and I think it's important to also know when you're doing the wrong thing.
Yeah.
Let's talk about Uber for 1 second.
Mm-hmm.
Uber.
Is that a sensitive topic this morning?
Hugely popular car service, built on a need, and launched in Paris, but then also in San Francisco, where we all know you can't get a cab to save your soul. And so it solved a need. But of recent times, they've been called on the carpet for some of their bad behavior with regard to data and how they're using it and what they're doing with it. And I think that it's really important to talk about that because as fast as you can become useful as a utility and being data-driven, which they are, you can also get a backlash, just like that.
Yeah. I think those feedback mechanisms are established. I mean, it's interesting. Uber has a particular culture. It's a pretty hard-headed culture over there, it seems. And so I think they are purposely a little tone deaf. But I was reading an interview with the CEO, I guess it was yesterday, where he's a little bit more conciliatory because he's realizing that he's getting a lot more institutional resistance. It's been banned in a lot of entire countries at this point, and I think he's realizing that policy of kind of like, I'm going to reinvent the world, which I know, it's great to be youthful and ambitious and all those things, but there's a pragmatic reality, which is you have to fuse into people's lives, they have to trust you. Great brands, trust is almost always one of their key attributes. And if you abuse that privilege, particularly when you're a young punk company, not that Uber is, I think it's an amazing company, but you've got to build that. And I think it's great that when people step over the line, it's interesting to watch. There's a dialogue going on here. Governments are part of it, consumers are part of it, companies are part of it. There's all these use cases that nobody ever envisioned before. If you had said, 10 years ago, there's going to be a startup that wipes out taxis in like 2 years, who would have believed you, right? And it's totally happened. Facebook, who would have thought? Or Google, all these companies have just completely reinvented each of their categories. And I think, pushback and a dialogue is good. It's very positive.
Well, disruptive technologies are something that I think we're seeing more and more of. And one of the things I'd like to talk about next is the disruptive platforms, if you will, for content distribution and how that's happening. And how do you, we've seen a number of companies talk about going streaming as opposed to being broadcast.
You mean over the top?
And obviously the generation that's cord cutting and not even subscribing to cable and doing things a different way. Talk a little bit about how that's going to change the landscape of the partnerships that we have with the content distribution platforms.
I got to choose my words on this one.
Okay.
Because all these guys are partners.
Of course.
Well, first of all, I think as a consumer, it's great. I want to watch what I want to watch, where I want to watch it, on what device I want to watch it, and I don't want to, get 50 channels of stuff that I don't want in order to see the Super Bowl, right? And I don't think I'm alone in that. Having content a la carte is huge, and it allows, I think it's great for everybody. It's great for the consumer, it's great for the producer. It may not be great for a handful of companies that control distribution choke points, but I think it's great for advertisers, right? The consumer wants the content, and we want to put the right message in front of the right consumer and have it be as close to appropriate and perfect and timed and narrative and tone and all those things. And I think this over-the-top stuff where you can get HBO, granted it's not ad-sponsored, but get it on your cell phone while you're waiting for your Uber to show up. It's great. I think and I'm really looking forward to the day when it completely fully happens. Now there's a lot of stuff, a lot of microtransactions, digital wallets, there's a lot of things that need to happen, and quite frankly, on our side as well. we need to get our platforms together, because reality is while we have DoubleClick and we now have Atlas, we have not fully created content that is truly customized, on the fly, appropriate, segmented, all those things. Technically we're not completely there yet, and creatively we're not completely there yet, but we're getting there, and that's a big part of this.
So just in closing, before we open it up to just a couple questions, what are your top 3 recommendations for things that agencies should be either looking at or doing in 2015?
2015, oh.
Or
gosh.
beyond.
Well, first of all, I think, I talked about the pendulum swinging. I mean, so many people just blindly go, oh my God, this is a geek, they must have the answer, right? No, this is about people, this is about fusion, this is about culture. I think coming back to the people side of things, I think there's an element of agencies which they're always sort of cool hunting, and while I just went off about CES and the Internet of Things, I'm not quite sure what to do yet, so I kind of like to sit back and wait and see what use cases are developing for things, and kind of look at what's here and now, and then where is it going to go. And so like right now I'm really focused on TV. Digital video is a big deal, and so figuring that out. I don't know, what's the third thing? Getting to work?
Getting to work.
Ordering my car early. Subway? No, just staying focused, do great. It's about work, right? It's really, the kind of cool thing about what we do is that feedback loop, which is just churning out work and then listening and feeding back, and like getting into that feedback loop of kind of experiment, learn, kill the bad stuff, accentuate the good stuff. The tighter you can make that feedback loop, I think the better off you're going to be. That isn't just a 2015 thing.
Right.
That's like a career thing. And I think the greatest companies, look at Amazon, they're brilliant at that, right? They try an idea, if it sucks, it's gone. If it's good, they double down on it, right? We need to do a lot quicker turns of this stuff in advertising.
Well, I think that's a really good lesson for agencies, because we haven't traditionally had a culture of failure. And I think that we have to institute that culture of it's okay to fail.
But we fail all the time. I think, not every ad is great.
Right.
In fact, most of them aren't. And, yet the good ones. And so I think we're getting better. I also think as an industry, we need to open up the aperture a little bit, meaning we are really set as an industry, and I get sort of why, but we're very focused on marketing messages. I think there's generally a pretty broadcast mentality, just we create a message, we send it out, we may sync social media with our Super Bowl commercial, but there's much more of a dialectic and feedback loop going on. I also think there's a couple other things that are arcing into our world, which are going to change it a lot. The measurement is huge, because clients are going to measure this stuff. They have to. As we should be, we will be held accountable in a relatively unaccountable industry, not for the first time, but increasingly so. That's a good thing. Second thing is it's interconnected. The message is now connected to commerce and sales, and that is also a really good thing. I'm super excited about what's happening with Apple Pay and all that, because I think it's going to connect the dots, and it's going to show actually how valuable a great marketing campaign is, because it'll be truly accountable. And then that last thing is that utility, which we touched on. So communications, utility, and commerce all are going to fit together, and I can't think of an industry that's better situated to take advantage of that than ours. So I'm pretty excited about where this goes.
That's great, thank you. I want to open it up for just a couple of questions. Sure, right there.
Hi, the advent of programmatic, and as it snowballs, you just look at an agency in 3 to 5 years, how will the structure of an agency change given programmatic advertising?
I don't know that it's going to change that much, which is sort of radical. I founded Acuant inside of Omnicom, but programmatic is really an auction system, right? And the data side of it will start to change. The insights of it will start to change. But the actual I/O mechanism, I mean, you'll have probably fewer people faxing I/Os back and forth and more computers talking to each other, which is how the rest of the world seems to do a lot of commerce. But I think it speeds up. I think we get better at addressing kind of right message, right person, right time, right device, which just accentuates everything that we've just talked about for 45 minutes.
Yeah, the dirty little secret is that they are still faxing IOs back and forth, which just blows my mind.
Some, yeah.
People ask for fax
That'll all
numbers.
change. I mean,
Yeah.
but the fact that it goes to auction-based systems, will change the media buying side of it, but it'll just create more insights for everybody else, I think. The questions around is the
Standardization.
data standards and sort of what to agree upon. I think naturally people start to come up with base language, and whether that's impressions or click-through or viewability or there's lots of different things.
Or digital GRP, which is
Digital
where we're headed.
GRP, which actually is sort of an interesting retro
Yeah.
refitting of a traditional idea onto digital, but I agree that you got to start somewhere. So I think naturally the things that should be measured start to be elevated and then standardized, and the 4A's and the IAB and the MRC and
The other
EMEA
alphabet.
and all the acronyms, BBDO, they all start to standardize.
Target data.
Targeting data? Well, you can't standardize everything, and I think that there's way too much data coming out to say, okay, we're going to try to standardize every single thing. There is a lot of art in data, right? And there will always be new things to measure. And so we are constantly looking for, okay, what is that new thing that's actually relevant, that has a signal that is appropriate, that is so-called clean data. I don't care if it's all standardized. I mean, that's part of what we do, is try to figure out how it works for us and our clients and whether it works or not.
Time for one more? Oh, right here. Okay.
Regarding television, digital video, and other video forms. Do you envision a standard valuation where one could compare an impression that's distributed through network television versus a video impression versus a mobile versus something else?
Sort of. And what I mean by that is, there's a very, I fully understand that there's a need to translate. The question was, is there going to be a standard around essentially translating traditional television into digital video? And there are obviously some things that are applicable across both, but the two media types and the experiences are actually quite different, as we all know. Anybody who's watched an ad on their cell phone versus an ad during the Super Bowl knows the difference, right? And so there is a need for comparison, digital GRP being a great example of that. You have to have some relationship of the two, but on the other hand, you have to take them as distinct mediums as well and say, okay, this one has the throughput and looks like this, and this one looks like that. And I think they both have very different. They have similar attributes in that it's sight, sound, and motion, and time, and attention, and they have very big differences because one happens on a very large screen, oftentimes in a couch-like setting, or in a bar, or whatever. The other one happens, inches away from you and is connected to everything else that's on the internet. So.
Okay, with that, we have to wrap up. Thank you, Jonathan.
Thank
It's
you,
been
Nancy.
great having you here this morning, and I'm going to turn it back over to Bill.
Great.
Thank you, everybody.
Our next speaker is Julie Fleischer. who's the Director of Data, Content, and Media of Kraft Foods. Julie unfortunately had a 2 flights canceled, so she's going to be presenting to us remotely, and we're just getting her set up. She will not be able to hear us, but we will see and hear from Julie. Before we start, I'd like to first thank our sponsors, CompScore, Rocket Fuel, and JWT for providing us this terrific space. Julie is actually a former client of mine. She oversees Kraft's leading industry CRM organization, as well as the Content Marketing Center of Excellence and Programmatic Media at Kraft. She's responsible for delivering excellence in content across Kraft's scaled owned media ecosystem and throughout social and paid media to drive business results, consumer engagement, and sustainable competitive advantage via the development of first-party data. Julie's part of the transformation of Kraft Foods from a traditional marketer to one that pushes the envelope to bring content marketing and data-driven marketing together as a source of sustainable competitive advantage throughout the media ecosystem, mining data to create content and experiences that create more data. Julie was named 2013 Content Marketer of the Year by the Content Marketing Institute. So I'm now looking for a thumb up, and we're going to turn it over to Julie.
I'm eager to share with you what's been going on at Kraft and the process of our marketing reinvent. So this is something that we started probably about 2 years ago, and it would certainly be premature to say that we are finished with our marketing reinvention. We're in the middle of the transformation, but wanted to share with you a little bit about what we've learned along the journey to date, as we've really looked to bring data into the heart of everything that we do from a marketing perspective. So going back about, well, I guess it's 2015, so let's call it 5 years ago now. We had some real challenges from a strategy, culture, and process perspective that we were dealing with. And I'll start with the strategy side. We were seeing, what was literally, in some cases, decades-long penetration declines on our brands. We had spent a significant amount of effort chasing volume. And what we ended up doing was we were subsidizing it. So we were moving more and more money into promotions and trade promotions, less from the A side of it. And we were finding that while our top line was still growing, although, on some of our brands anemically, we really weren't keeping the business healthy. And we wanted to get back to this idea of growing penetration and growing brand health. At the same time, if you looked at what we were doing from a media perspective in 2010, it was very much about scale and mass versus strategic targets. And really what that resulted in, or what that looked like, was a very television-centric approach to the world. And it was a very cheap CPM television-centric approach to the world. We were buying lots and lots and lots and lots of different networks and cable networks. We were aggregating our buys into clusters and then assigning them to brands rather than building plans from the brand up. And we were really looking at how cheaply we could buy rather than how strategically we could define and develop a target. So from a culture perspective, what you would have seen if you looked here, and I've worked in the center for a long time, so I always take a bit of offense to the arrogant center, because I don't believe anyone was, or most of us were particularly arrogant in terms of how we operated. But there was a sense that the center was defining the way we would go to market in absence of feedback and direction and needs from the specific brands. So what that looked like was, this is the way we're going to go to market. We're going to do it on a scale basis, and we'll tell you how it's done, and we'll tax you back for the amount of money you owe us, and here's what your rebill is for the year. And the center got very, very large and had a significant amount of sway, if not actual control. And related to that, I won't say causing that, but certainly related to that, was the very decentralized decision-making that we have. So we have a BU structure. Kraft has historically been a very decentralized organization. Each of the BUs in everything other than media was really able to make all of their own decisions. It manifested itself with 18 different creative agencies. So there was a lot of different characters and personalities and approaches and philosophies to deal with. And at the same time, we had some BUs that were just, torpedoing the center and bringing in their own different media agencies. So we were losing scale in that respect. We also had sort of operationally what I would call a do what worked last year mentality. So we're a very mix-driven company. We would look at our efficiencies from the previous year, our paybacks from the previous year, and then we would make minor revisions based on that, but nothing major. And so we were chasing media trends that were really shifting very, very quickly, but we were looking at them with very status quo kind of an orientation. And beyond mix, we had certainly a limited commitment to measurement. So there was very little that would tell the organization what was working or what wasn't working, and certainly very little diagnostics that would help us be smarter and get better over time. So that's where we stood from a cultural perspective. And then from a process perspective, there was a significant amount of indecision, which led to, which didn't lead to, which was related to, really a lack of respect for the work of the agencies, the center, and for, sort of the place where math and magic come together in the work that we do. And what that led to was replans and replans and replans and replans and churn, which didn't drive any value for anyone. It just drove costs, it drove frustration, and it drove a sense that this was, something that essentially, marketing at this point is really darts in the wall. So, we'll just throw them out there and we'll see where they land, because there really wasn't a significant amount of appreciation for the work that goes into marketing communications. Related to that, there was very little partnership and very little trust. The brands didn't look to their agency partners as strategic leads or as experts. And I think that the agencies were just expecting that any decision was then going to be overturned or, questioned again, or budgets would change. And so we were making very, very little progress. And media at that point was certainly the last step in the process. So creative agencies would build ad-like objects, they would build television, they would build print, and then they would say, okay, go buy this. And that was the state of the planning process at the time. And at the same time, from a business backdrop, things were difficult. Things are difficult. So you have to look at what's been happening over the past 5 years. Millennials have come of age, and I am sure for all of you in the room and me on the phone, that's been particularly challenging in the world of CPG, because they look different, shop different, cook different, buy different, value different, live different than the generations before them. So, millennials are living at home longer. They're marrying later. They're not buying homes. They're not buying cars. They spend a lot more on takeout than they do on cooking. And when they do cook, they want to cook with very, very, natural, organic, not processed kinds of ingredients. They shop at different stores. One of the really interesting things we discovered a few years ago, particularly if you look at younger male millennials, their pantry is the convenience store. They don't shop and stock up things and put them in their cabinets and then decide what to eat at night. They'll just run out and get it, or they'll just order it. I was listening to the radio yesterday, and there was some guy who says he goes out for burgers 8 to 10 times a week, but not McDonald's, Shake Shack and In-N-Out, because while he wants that kind of food, he also wants it to be a better quality. So millennials have been coming of age, and they've been challenging for us as a company and as an industry. At the same time, there's been a rapid shift in channel assortment. So if you think about where groceries were bought 20 years ago, they were bought at grocery stores. Now they're bought at grocery stores, they're bought at big box stores, they're bought at mass merch, they're bought at convenience stores, they're bought online through Amazon Prime. You've got delivery coming on board now with, Instacart and services like that. You've got specialty stores like Whole Foods and Trader Joe's. And one of the things that we've found is, advertising ROIs have been contracting in our industry for the past 5 years or so. And it's because we've been advertising the same way, but we've been missing more and more of the millennials. And then also we don't have our products available in the stores that they shop, because this has been a significant change for us in terms of supply chain and distribution and where our products are available. So you've got millennials coming of age, you've got this rapid shift in channel assortment. And then, you have everything that we deal with in our industry in terms of the rise of digital and social and mobile and all of the different channels that are competing for consumers' attention and fragmenting, so that there's more and more places that we need to go in terms of reaching these audiences. So the communication landscape has been, complex and difficult for all of us to be getting ahead of over more than the past 5 years, over the last 15. And yet, we still had the same media agency SOW as we did in the year 2000. So same staffing, same organization, very, very little approach to digital. All of these new channels popped up, and we were just trying to sort of, meet them with the same SOW that we had. So this clearly wasn't going to work. And two things that we say internally at Kraft are, number one, the pace of change will never be slower than it is today. This is something that, we've been talking about for the past 2 years, because I think there was a sense in terms of, top senior management and even on our brands that, if things would just slow down for a minute, if things would, if you just give us a minute to breathe, we can sort of figure all of this out and then we'll get back on a normal trajectory. But that's just not the case. It's just getting faster and faster and faster. And then the other piece of it, which is the perfect bookend, is a Jack Welch quote, which is, if change is happening on the outside faster than it's happening on the inside, the end is in sight. And so we really felt like we were sitting in a place where it was clear that it was happening outside faster than inside, and we didn't want to go down with that ship. So with that, we looked at what did we need to do to understand this current operating environment and how could we succeed. And so we brought in new leadership about 2 years ago, 2.5 years ago now, and created a new vision for marketing within Kraft. And there's a few pieces that go along with this in terms of, again, strategy and culture and process, as we looked at who we wanted to be and how we wanted to go to market. The first thing is that we have a belief now that data is really the only source of competitive advantage. Data will really be the thing that separates companies moving forward. How much do you know about your consumer? How much do you know about your business environment? And what can you do to activate against that? How sharp can your insights be? How addressable can your marketing be? And how can you gain a proprietary advantage through data and through the knowledge of your consumer that your competitor can't have? We looked at what we had in our arsenal, and we've had for the past 18 years or so an organization that I run that we call CRM, which is really the craftrecipes.com website, a paid subscription magazine, and our larger social footprint that speaks to the entire enterprise. And we've had this advantage hidden in plain sight for 18 years. We've been talking to our consumers, but we hadn't been really pulling out the first-party data that they were providing us in terms of their interactions with our content. And so we started to look at how we could build up this pool of proprietary data. Secondly, we believe that this idea of data and what it can be in terms of a competitive advantage is really the responsibility of everyone. And so we spent the first part of 2014 training 400 marketers and 18 different creative agencies and all of our CIS teams about data and what they needed to know in terms of data literacy and how to activate on it. We also believed as a strategy that measurement is how we demonstrate value and measurement is how we will be graded. And so we've spent a significant amount of energy and resources driving measurement of everything that we do so we can understand what's working and what's not working and get better at it. And then finally, from a strategic perspective, we looked at realigning skills and resources. So we took a look at that media agency SOW that hadn't changed since 2000, and we rewrote it in 2013. And we shifted a lot of the kinds of skill sets we needed. So we went very, very heavy in terms of strategy and analytics and digital, so that we could build a team that was able to take advantage of this new strategy and really drive it to ground. And this is the just sort of fundamental expression of our reinvention. It's three things. It is data, infrastructure, and content. So data is how we know consumers, how we know who they are, what they value, what they need, how to find them. Infrastructure is how we reach them and the advanced analytics to know whether we are reaching them in a way that drives not just attitudes, but also behaviors. And then content is the way that we engage them. And we've gotten to a place where we recognize that the more discreetly you know your consumers and the more addressably you can reach them, the more specific the content needs to be in order to engage them. So as our data journey grows, and we've created something like 1,000 custom segments for our brands over the past year, our content needs change as well. And we're thinking about how to produce content differently, how to serve content differently, and how to tell stories differently through that content. From a culture perspective, the center really is more now the servant and partner. So the center is doing as much as it did before, but doing it in a way that is more in service to the brand. So a specific example of that is instead of buying all of our television in 8 clusters, we now build plans from the bottom up for each brand. And that's what informs our buying strategy. It really is built on a brand-by-brand basis. And we've brought in new data sources so we can be more targeted and more precise on even our television buying. We're still a center of excellence and call ourselves a center of excellence, but we really are looking to create subject matter experts. The idea is not to have a center that is always responsible for things like reviewing flowcharts. The idea is that the center is, the subject matter expert in terms of data and how we move that roadmap along and how we progress faster. So we really want to train all of our marketers so that they understand the fundamentals and can take more responsibility for the things that matter to their brands. We very much have a test and learn mantra. So, we moved from just doing what we did last year to a really committed 70-20-10 plan for our marketing, and really always testing something new and then not walking away from it if it doesn't work, but learning from it and adjusting and moving forward so that when the time comes and new tactics and channels become more measurable and more scalable, we're ready. And now I would say we really do have a true agency partnership. And, Starcom, who is our media agency and incredibly important to all of this marketing reinvention that we've done. They are not just, I would say they don't just have a seat at the table, but they have a seat at the head of the table now. They really are our most valuable strategic partner in terms of driving our transformation to become a data-driven organization. And from a process perspective, we have new tools that we've brought upstream so that we can understand at a more granular level our consumer and our audiences before we start to make advertising and different storytelling engagement kinds of content, so that we know who we're talking about and we know where we're going to be talking to them and how we're going to be talking to them before we start to define creative. We have this content and media marriage where the two pieces really do come together. And we've shifted to a brand hub organization so that we create more unity around our brand trademarks. Instead of having 10 different craft brands that all go to market separately, we're now aggregating that craft brand and we're planning it at a master brand level. And that brings us to different places and different opportunities as we think about how we go to market. So just briefly, because I know I'm running out of time here, I'll talk about our results to date. And as I said, we are in the midst of this transformation. It's more early days than later days. We've made a significant amount of progress, but there's a long way to go. So I would say, in terms of driving penetration and returning to brand health, it's still early days. We're seeing improvements on some of our brands, many of our brands, but not enough of our brands. So penetration and brand health is important to us. And we're working very hard to understand what are the strategies and tactics that drive penetration versus drive buy rate, and how do we use data to go to market more strategically to be focusing on penetration. We're doing lots of tests, which has resulted in lots of learning. And happily now, not only are we doing test and learn within brands, we're also doing it from an organizational perspective across brands. So we have architected and orchestrated some of those tests and learns so that the benefit can be accrued across the entire organization. And the same thing can be said from a measurement perspective. So we're looking at measurement within each of the brands, but also across all of our brands, so that we can accrue and extract those learnings on behalf of the entire enterprise. Again, that's a shift away from this hyper decentralized organization that we had always had. We've seen double-digit gains in digital ROI, not just double-digit percentage gains, but literally double-digit gains. So we're feeling very, very confident that this data infrastructure and organization that we put together is on the right track, which is wonderful. We do also believe that, first-party data is what I like to think of as Craft's unfair advantage. What is the thing that we have that others cannot match? And that is the depth of knowledge that we have about our consumers on a first-party basis. And we're working to build that and drive that. So we've got a very, very specific, strategic, and advanced first-party data strategy. And we're working to use that to create this proprietary insight into our consumers. We've also, I'm very proud to say, have the highest ratings ever for our partner Starcom. So, we, as I'm sure all other companies like we do, have surveys that go out twice yearly so that we understand performance. And we have really seen dramatic improvements in terms of the relationship, the respect, and the partnership that our brands have with Starcom as our media agency. But there is still more to do. We have a very, very aggressive roadmap. I would say both in terms of how we want to go to market externally and think about how we market to consumers, but also internally in terms of how we continue this education process and how we train our marketers to think differently in this new world. And our CIS partners and our IT partners and really the entire organization to win in a data-driven context. And so that's a glimpse at the reinvention that we've had at Craft. I hope that's been helpful. Since I haven't had a chance to see any of you or talk to any of you, on Twitter, I'm at JFly, JFLY, and I hope you'll tweet me and let me know your thoughts and how this was. And I really appreciate you sharing the morning with me, even though I couldn't be there. Thank you so much. Bye-bye.
I'm going to have the panelists introduce themselves because they got big titles and I don't know them. Why don't we just go left to right here, or right to left, or whatever?
Mike Glasser, I'm on the marketing team at Google, and I help run an innovation program called Art, Copy, and Code, where we partner with brands and agencies to innovate on the Google stack.
I'm Artie Bulger, and I run global research and analytics for ESPN.
Good morning, everybody. My name is Josh Chasen, and I am the Chief Research Officer at ComScore.
Good morning. I'm Christian Borges. I am the Senior Vice President of Marketing at TrueX, the leading engagement advertising platform.
Good morning. My name is Simon Rogers. I'm a data editor at Twitter, and before that, I edited the Guardian data blog, so I guess I'm a journalist working with data to tell stories.
All right, where to start? I'm wondering if we should maybe kind of give a high-level view of like the state of things in terms of using data for online advertising. I think a couple of years ago, it was there were a lot of companies coming out with a lot of venture money like Xlate and BlueKai, and the data exchange was the thing you heard a lot about, and people were buying and selling data. It seems like that practice is sort of out of favor, and it's all about first-party data or unique identifier data. I don't know, would you guys agree with like the act of buying data is kind of on its way out and it's all about first party, or is the data marketplace still an active one? I don't know, who wants to jump in on that one?
I'll jump in from the beginning. Julie was great, and Julie Fleischer also spoke at an AdAge data conference just a few months ago. I wasn't there, but I read about it, and it was a terrific message. And one of the things that she talked about was that there are three oxymorons in our business: data integrity, advertising integrity, and measurement integrity. She touched on some of those, but I think it speaks to this issue. And one of the things that they found at Kraft as they were going through this process, which she described, was they did an analysis of their third-party data sources, data overlay, and the conventional wisdom was that they are accurate to about 60% of the time. They found that the accuracy rate was more like 15 or 20%, right? So it's a huge issue in our business. And I think it speaks to the fact that we have this sort of data integrity problem. It leads to a measurement integrity problem, which I'm sure we'll get into. But it also speaks to, I think, what's happened over the past couple of years is that the significant focus as a result of all that on first-party data, right? And so we have to pay attention to that very, very closely. And I think the value is in the marriage of the first-party data, perhaps that a client like Kraft has, that can bring to a publisher like ESPN or anybody else. But we have to be very, very careful about how we manage that and make sure that it has the highest integrity possible to get the job done.
So, I mean, that sounds like to me, it's like either you use your own data or some publisher's registration data, or like, somebody like Facebook's data, or otherwise you're taking a really big risk. You know what you're getting. Is that kind of the state of things, or is that too extreme? Anybody?
Well, I think it's interesting that the market, I get the sense that the market has changed a bit, and that there's a ton of public data out there in a way that wasn't before, APIs and so on. At the same time, there is some data that you can only get by buying it in kind of bulk. That might be Twitter data or other kind of sources. And it's all about the source and knowing you trust that source. So you've kind of got one end, you've got this kind of giant kind of open public data, the government data and so on, that you can probably trust because of where it's from. And at the other end, you've got this new data, social media data, which you've had to buy. And then in the middle, there's the stuff that you've got to kind of weigh up how valuable it is and really whether the source is good enough.
What about, as we're going towards, it's been talked about for years that when you go into a mobile advertising world or bigger, where mobile makes up a bigger piece of what you're doing, cookies are pretty worthless, although there's been some stuff about Verizon trying to develop a super cookie and other vendors. But now that for some publishers, mobile is like half of their traffic, and more advertisers are putting money into mobile, it seems like it's either the winners are going to be the folks that can identify you every step of the way, and that's probably Apple, Google, Facebook, or Twitter, or somebody else. But I've heard a lot of advertisers complain about that's great. Those guys have great data, they have powerful reach, but I don't want to buy. I don't want to have a bunch of all my ad buys siloed off by like I can only buy this AOL universe and this Facebook universe here, and I want to be able to buy media across whatever I want to do and not have to rely on these third parties to be my tour guide for mobile. Where do you guys see that going as time goes on?
Well, I'll say something about that. So that is a challenge, right? But I tend to think that the demand of the advertisers is going to hold sway. So we're going to have some sort of unique identifier for a mobile user. I don't think we know what that is yet. And the fact that all these companies are building their own unique identifiers is very positive, and it's a step on the way. There may end up being some sort of third-party bridge, right, where you can link Apple, and I mean, I don't want to name companies here, but so you can link a third party can link the unique identifiers from the different sort of closed systems. There will be something that enables you to target individuals in the mobile ecosystem, and the reason we know that's going to happen is because there's an awful lot of money that wants to flow in that direction, and every one of those companies you mentioned is going to rise with the tide if the money flows.
Right, but they're not companies that are inclined to cooperate on these kind of things. They're companies that want to run the whole show, right? Like, I guess why be so confident that there's going to be a universal identifier, neutral third party out there when these are companies that want to dominate the internet?
Well, so it might not be hey, I'm one of the 4 companies that runs mobile. I'm going to voluntarily pass my data along to a third party. But it might be that there are technologies and techniques for understanding unique identifiers of these 4 companies or 5 companies and putting them together. I could see my company doing something like that, for example.
Just to add, I would say, just as there's been a lot of discussion over viewability and how do we define it, and through the 3MS initiative, everyone has come together to help define that and roll that out. I see in the future, hopefully a partnership between the big tech providers, the big publishers, all coming together to solve that, right? I don't think any one provider is going to be able to solve it in isolation because you have unique IDs, you've got publishers with logged in data on both sides, you've got Google, Apple. So only when they do come together can we establish a standard.
And you guys you're not worried about a world where it's going to be Facebook's mobile web or Google's mobile web, because these are companies that are not inclined to cooperate a whole lot.
I'm still worried it's going to be AOL's internet. So,
I don't think there's any one company that is the solution. I think there's so much data out there in the first place, and brands and companies are still trying to figure out what's the most relevant, what's the most important amount of data to help move their business and to connect with consumers, whether that's online or offline, or on mobile or otherwise. So I think there's just such a crush of data in the first place. We, as an industry, haven't even figured out what's important, what's the most relevant, much less how to track it all and how to streamline it so that it actually makes sense.
Why don't we shift gears off of this mobile topic for a second? Because you brought up viewability, and I think that's a pretty hot topic of late, and it seems like there's a ton of frustration about the data out there, and especially on the publisher side, that there's 15 vendors measuring viewability. Nobody knows if they can actually do it to even a confidence of more than 80%. There's talk the best guys can only measure like 80% of your campaign, and then the rates are all over the place. People are saying it's holding back dollars, holding back spending. How bad is the viewability right now?
Well, I'll speak from a publisher perspective. It's kind of a mess. I mean, the good news is that we have a standard, or at least an attempt at a standard. The problem is you have a dozen or so vendors that have a varied level of agreement, and it makes it very, very difficult to do business in terms of whether or not you think that you're going to have 80% of your impressions viewable, or perhaps 50 or 60% of your impressions viewable. The other issue is that the viewability standard and these vendors are only able to touch on a small portion of incidences. For example, it's really not, there are still standard issues with respect to rich media, with respect to large-sized ads. We have homepage takeovers, which is a big part of our business. What about audio when it comes to video? I mean, there are so many questions that still exist with respect to viewability. And there are a lot of end users of the viewability standard that don't even know that.
Yeah. So I'll comment a little on this, if I may, as a vendor. There are actually 16, I believe, viewability providers accredited by the MRC. There are probably more than that. Those are just the ones that are accredited. And I say that, I need to note that I haven't checked their website this morning. So as of yesterday, there were 16 accredited. What we have, so first of all, I'm going to say there's a little bit of a misconception going on, that if one company says 90% viewable and another company says 70% viewable, the difference must be because the second company isn't seeing as many impressions. That's not the case. You can see a document on the MRC's website that will tell you who can see into what, and I will tell you, there are a number of companies who can see into 97-ish% or more of impressions. And my personal belief is that that's going to be table stakes, and if you can't see into 97-ish% or more of impressions, you're not going to last in this space, okay? So the notion of my viewability is lower because the vendor can't see into impressions is false. For one thing, you need to disclose how many you know are viewable, how many you know are not viewable, and how many you couldn't make an observation on. And that group you either leave out of the equation or you make a projection or a model on. So you don't necessarily show lower viewability if you're one of those companies that can't see into all the impressions. What we have seen, and part of this is because my company, Comscore, has been diligent about, and Mike and I were talking about this for 2 seconds before we came up here. We've been diligent about identifying and excluding fraud and non-human traffic. And what we have seen is that when we look at our data and other companies' data side by side, the biggest driver of the differences, I'm not saying it's the only driver, but I'm prepared to tell you it's the biggest driver, is the extent to which one or the other company is able to identify and exclude fraud. Now, we often have lower reported viewability than our competitors, and it turns out the reason is because there are millions of impressions on a campaign that we are identifying as non-human or fraudulent, and thus a priori calling not viewable, and we see other companies calling them viewable. And I will also tell you that the MRC had a call with the viewability vendors a couple of weeks ago, where we talked about all the different things that could cause differences between the vendors. George Ivey at the MRC says he believes that everything else being equal, if you put the different vendor technologies on the same impression, will all make the same non-viewable disposition. And I take him at his word. I think he's probably right. It's these other things, and I will tell you, especially fraud and non-human traffic, that are driving the differences between the different numbers. And the MRC is working very diligently to identify all these variables and get to a place where we can understand the differences between vendors. By the way, they put a call out through the IAB for advertisers who have campaigns that have been tagged from multiple viewability providers to share that data with the MRC. And if any of you are in that position, I would urge you to do that.
But Josh, what you've just outlined is in fact detailing a host of issues that affect consistency and measurement.
Yeah.
It's just a fact.
Agreed.
So
Agreed.
why? Jump in, I'm sorry.
No, I was just going to say I agree with everything that you just said. I 100% believe that we are in a state of crisis right now with regards to measurability. For one, the bar is so low right now with regards to what we're measuring. 50% of a view at 2 seconds or 1 second is unacceptable. And I don't know anybody here who thinks that that is a win, as the joint letter that was disclosed last week says it's a win. I think it's a start and it's a beginning, but it's just the tip of the iceberg. I think there's so much more work that has to be done as far as really defining, coming up with a viable definition of what an impression is. Further, are all impressions created equally? So if I see one ad for 2 seconds, 50%, is that worth the same amount as one ad that I see for 100% of that ad for 30 seconds? Those are the questions I think as an industry we should be answering and we should be moving ourselves towards and figuring that out, not claiming that we've won right now.
I mean, that's a pretty strong word. You use crisis. I wondered, do you guys feel like the industry rushed this? Like, why did it seems like it's not ready for prime time. If not having gone through any of it, it sounds like if you can't even match up the data, there's too many vendors. Like, did we go way too fast in this?
I'm going to take the positive side of this, which is 18 months ago, I would say we were even in more of a state of disarray. We had multiple ways to look at this. We were sort of debating what viewability means. So I think the progress made in 18 months is great. The fact that we can have an open dialogue about what is measurement, is it 1 second, 2 second, how is that different between display and video? The fact that we have choice, whether that's Comscore, Nielsen, Google's solution, is huge progress. Did we rush it or not? I don't know, but I think if we can maintain sort of forward motion, we'll get there.
Let me add something. I don't think we rushed to it. I think, if anything, we were probably late to this. I mean, the digital side of the media business has always needed, standards, particularly in terms of enabling it to become part of, a cross-platform solution. So I applaud, certainly what the 3MS initiative did. I think what was sort of underestimated was the level of governance that was necessary to carry this out. And we're learning as we're doing, and I think we need a higher level of discussion, certainly between advertiser agency as well as publisher, to sort of hash this out, because we're discovering these issues along the way. If you think about it, when the whole 3MS initiative started, there were virtually no apps in the mobile space, right? There were no tablets. And then, so from a URL perspective, we sort of had things nailed, at least we think we did. Apps came along and really disrupted the whole business. So, we're constantly playing catch up, but I think this issue of governance is one I think that we have to get a handle on.
So when agencies and advertisers say, you guys knew this was coming, you had a few years to fix your site, like, come on, why are you complaining about it now? The landscape changed radically over that time.
Absolutely right.
All right.
I think some of it's been rushed, and I'll tell you what I mean by that. I think the display part was not rushed, because there was like a 4-year run-up to it. But what I've observed, and I've made my feelings clear about this, is that once we had a display set of standards in place and codified, the industry said, okay, now let's put that into video. Let's translate that to video. Oh, now let's translate that into mobile. Without asking ourselves the question, is there an issue in video? If there is, what is the issue? And one of the big things with viewability is fundamentally the content in display. The content's here, the ad is here. The content's here, the ad is here. The content's here, the ad is here. In video, so there's two different pieces of screen real estate that are occupied. In video, the ad and the content occupy the same screen real estate. Now, there's an issue within banner video, because sometimes that can just be run, God knows where on a page. But basically, if you're talking about high-quality premium video, if somebody chooses to run the player's on the screen, and you don't have this screen real estate issue. And I feel like we haven't really had the time to vet the issues in other platforms besides computer display before we rushed into the process of figuring out how we need to apply viewability in other arenas. And I'm worried that we're going to rush into it in mobile too.
Did the MRC screw up by accrediting 15 companies?
The MRC never screws up.
Right. I know that.
Never.
No one screws up
Never.
in this industry.
I think the issue
please quote me on that.
I think the issue is you have to understand what accreditation means, and I think that's where there is some level of ambiguity. I think if you understand what accreditation means, that a company meets minimum standards and they're doing what they say they do, that's what an audit does. But that doesn't solve the problem. We still have this issue of interpretation and tremendous variance across all these vendors.
All right, we're going down a viewability rat hole, and it's my fault. So let's totally change topics here if we can. For a long time in this industry, we've talked about how data is going to allow marketers to have, almost like one ad for every person, or the right ad for the right person, right time. Recently, there's been, and that's mostly been theory, I think. Other than retargeting, I think it's been mostly been theoretical. But recently, we've done a couple stories in this, like one auto brand is doing. It was timed to the Super Bowl, was doing 70 different Facebook video ad executions, and then Lexus was doing something like 1,000 unique video ads that were using all kinds of different targeting data. How close are we to being able to roll these feedback? Like these might be just kind of one-off cool executions, or how far are we from these being standards, or something kind of common that you see in the industry a lot more? Anybody have any thoughts on that?
We on our team at Google, we just finished up a 17-week program with EA Sports around the launch of their Madden video game for the NFL season. We actually tried this out. So we built a content engine that takes a live data feed from the NFL and parses out all the teams, the scores, the players, and the game clock. Uses that data to decide what creative shows up in ads. And then we paired that with 32 different audience segments, one for each affinity for a football team, and ran that over the course of 17 weeks. And what was interesting there is, in 17 weeks, we ran 1,250 pieces of creative that were all algorithmically generated. And that dynamic creative outperformed the control group, which was just sort of static, traditional video game ads, from a factor of 40 to 50%. So I think the data suggests that you can programmatically do that, and if you build it in a way up front, you can also scale it where you can have hundreds, if not thousands, of pieces of creative.
So the obvious question there is, how hard was that to do? Like, is that something you can do a couple times a year for some really big budgets, or is it like, how far away are we from being able to do that a lot?
Sure. I think with the right talent, it's not too far away. I think the folks who are innovating in sort of the digital, and specifically where we were playing, which was the display ad space, could build this across multiple different verticals or challenges. The display ads will support all of it. It was a matter of taking a data feed and picking the right creative.
How about video? Can that be done? Or is it?
Sure. Yeah.
And that's not going the production costs are not going to be so astronomical that a brand's going to be freaked out about doing that?
I think video, it puts more onus on the upfront planning part. We intentionally spent a few weeks mapping out from a display ad standpoint how we'd have to build this. Had we chosen video, we would have done it the same way. But either way, you're investing more creative time upfront, and the benefit is during the campaign itself, you almost set it and forget it.
What is data leakage, and should I be worried about it? Do I have it? Is it happening now? No, I mean, does anybody have any thoughts on, there's always a talk of the threat of losing my data or someone taking my data, and I don't know how far we've come in terms of cleaning that up, or is that how real that fear is. Does anybody have any thoughts on that?
Well, I think it's something that, certainly as a publisher, I'm very, very mindful of, especially as we're in the process of building a DMP right now, which opens up any risk of exposing your data. Third parties capturing some of that data. There's the risk of, currencies and validation firms and viewability firms that come in contact with your users somehow to pick up audience data, et cetera, et cetera. So we have to make sure that we are diligent about this, that we have ownership of our data. So it's going to be a big question for years to come, I think.
I think there's an interesting question here about kind of the mosaic effect of different data sets working together. So individually, you might have the most secure data set in the world, but when you put those two or three things together, it is possible to identify somebody. You saw the New York taxi data that was released recently, and this developer just took it. It was supposed to be anonymized. This developer took it and worked out. You could actually see this taxi was picked up by Bradley Cooper here, and he paid this much tip to the driver and went that journey. And I think there's a kind of, that's just by putting a couple of data sets together. And it doesn't take much. You just have to be a bit smart and know what you're doing.
Interesting that you guys have a DMP. You hear brands talking about it. That's almost becoming a must. Like, is everyone in the ecosystem need to be working with a DMP these days? Is that table stakes?
I think it's becoming so. Yeah.
Now, and what about the talk of brands want to manage their data through DMP, but then Google, Facebook will only let you work with their buying tools, which causes limitations for brands and how much targeting they can do. Like, how much of that is an issue in the industry right now?
I think what we've seen, specific on that program that we did, EA Sports used a mixture of different solutions. I don't know that there's a one-stop shop where you can just sort of drag and drop your data, but because their campaign was operating at multiple levels, from awareness to influencing consideration to e-commerce, they used their first-party data, but also Google data for different reasons and at different times.
And do they have to use your tools, or can they use their own buying software?
They have. I mean, any brand can use their own in combination with Google or on their own.
Can their tool talk to your tool?
We can take their first-party data.
Yeah, sure.
Yes. But again, it comes down to what their goals are. In their instance, their first-party data was console owners, which is great if I'm trying to sell you a video game. It's not, perhaps it's too limiting if I want to raise your awareness or interest in the broader sort of Madden franchise.
Let's shift gears again to TV. Last couple upfronts, you're hearing a lot more examples of advertisers wanting data baked into their TV buys in some fashion. I guess I wonder, I'm not sure who has good perspective on this here, but how much of this is still in, like, an advertiser wants to check the box that they tested this kind of thing this year, versus, like, is data becoming a really big part of the television buying process? And I wonder, is that mostly trying to find obscure shows that you wouldn't normally buy with using data, or is it like the more internet advertising, like targeting specific consumers using like, you know, I only want to buy that house because they have a dog and I'm selling dog food. Those are two big broad questions, but does anybody have a good perspective on the state of data and TV advertising?
Well, I think there are a couple of things that are going on there. I mean, there is, you know, for example, what Simul Media does, which is really using data aligned with Nielsen data to, you know, target households and deliver ads to that audience, not necessarily selectively to those households. We're not there yet because we're still sort of in a linear space. I think the future is about, you know, I think the future of television is that it is still a premium environment. Nothing trumps television in terms of driving brands and driving brand awareness. It is sort of where everything starts in terms of integrated media campaign for the most part. But we're going to live in a world, I think, where we're going to have sort of hybrid capabilities with television, where we're going to still have that sort of linear ads. I mean, it's going to be a long, long time before you're going to see, you know, the Super Bowl with any sort of, you know, DAI, you know, capability. But we already have that, right? And when we think about, you know, for example, what we're seeing at ESPN in terms of over-the-top devices, and again, this is where we need simply better television measurement so that there's transparency to this. But our own first-party data tells us that there is an explosion going on in terms of usage of over-the-top devices for our linear television stream on those devices like Apple TV and Roku and what have you, to the point where it's still a very sort of nascent penetration in the marketplace. But in our case, it's representing, in that space, it's representing in the digital video space, you know, more than half of the ad starts. So I think where data comes into play here is, and this comes to the broader question of cross-platform measurement, where almost everything we're talking about here today is focused on digital media platforms, and somehow we got to connect that to television, right? And I think that's where we're going to have really an explosion of riches, in my opinion. So we need cross-platform measurement. We need transparency to do that. And data will be a big piece of that, where we can orchestrate campaigns, whereas there's sort of the linear buy reaching, delivering reach, significant reach, because reach is now a commodity that's harder to get. Yep. But at the same time, selectively selling ads that are data-informed, data-delivered based on the matches of, let's say, our data set and our client's data set. To deliver impact and reduce the waste, you know, that I talked about, Julie was talking about before. To me, that's a big part of our future, and it's going to make television infinitely more powerful than it is today. But we need those tools, we need those capabilities, and again, we need some sort of cross-platform measurement tool to help guide all of this.
Yeah.
Josh, you want to jump in?
I do. So, who saw the Kim Kardashian ad on the Super Bowl? Most everybody. What brand was that for? Okay, so here's the thing. We just had this shared experience, right? That's got to be worth something for T-Mobile. We all know it was T-Mobile. Now, you could like that ad, you could not like that ad, but it made a point, right? And we as a nation experienced that ad. Now, it's great for the Super Bowl that you can buy one spot on one program and do that, but there are other, you know, you can still use network television to get commercials, network, including cable television, to get messages out to everybody, and the fact that everybody sees that message at roughly the same time, and when I say roughly the same time, I mean in a week, let's say, that still has value. And let's not lose the value of, as Artie says, the reach of television, because we have this opportunity to introduce data into the mix. Now, you know, it is true that if you look at what's happening to the television audience, little pieces of it are getting sliced off and delivered in other fashions, you know, like OTT, online video, but you know, and at some point, you know, we all sort of forecast that eventually that's where all TV is going to go. But for the time being, there is still that notion of reach. You know, and again, I'm just parroting what Artie said, but the massive reach of television, and there is a value not to getting every household its own ad, but to getting America your ad. There is some value to that, and let's not forget that.
Coca-Cola is just trying to sell one more bottle of Coke each and every day, and there's the buyer's out there somewhere.
I think you know, I agree with everything that everyone's saying, and I don't purport to be an expert on television advertising per se, but I do think that, you know, the Super Bowl is one moment in time where you know you have scale and you know you have reach, and you're playing the odds, and the odds are in your favor. For the most part, day in, day out, we don't watch TV that way. Between OTT, between the cutting of the cord, cable cord, between the cat and mouse game that we're playing with consumers as far as we keep trying to figure out ways to target consumers, where they are, how they are, in ways that are relevant or not relevant, disruptive or not disruptive, and they keep figuring out ways of avoiding us. Whether it's paying a premium, you know, they're paying for Netflix, they're paying for HBO now, they'll be paying for all of these services, you know, direct. They pay for Pandora, they pay for all of these services to avoid ads. So I just think it's an interesting quandary that we're in right now. I don't think that, you know, I definitely agree that television still has power in that medium, but comparing it to the Super Bowl, I think that's one moment in time. I think we're definitely in a moment of change right now.
Yeah, and if you guys ever spend any time consuming a lot of television content, either over the top or through VOD or even on on your iPad app, the ad experience is either non-existent or it's the same ad 1,000 times or it's just house ads. It's pretty abysmal, and I wonder why. There seems to be such a huge obvious opportunity to use data to provide better targeted advertising there. Is it just do the TV networks not care about that because it's like small potatoes? Is it you can't get the good data because the cable companies? Is it the brands don't care? Like, what's holding that up to unleashing that opportunity? Does anybody have thoughts on that?
I think part of it is just the seamless technology, getting over sort of the challenges of actually serving ads across all those different platforms, right? It's not like we're talking about, you know, one standard across all platforms, and I think that's been the challenge for a while. But we're beginning to overcome that. We're dealing with different players, for example. When we can't use the ESPN player, we have to adapt to somebody else's player, so there are complications. But again, you know, this is sort of the disruption that digital technology brings, but we're learning and we're getting over those issues. And I think you're going to see the treatment of that ad space become much more relevant, much more fluid, and a much better experience very, very quickly.
Anybody else have thoughts on the state of data and television advertising? No. All right.
Well, we need better measurement, that's for sure.
Right.
You know, right now we've got a great currency that is measuring television as was defined maybe 15, 20 years ago, and there's a lot of audience out there that is not being accounted for.
You guys brought up fraud. I'm always interested. It seems like, you know, that was the hot topic of the last couple of years, and like if you talk to group bodies like the IAB, they're very confident we're going to stamp this out. All the agencies are suddenly preaching how they're going to buy only on private exchanges, and this is all going to go away. But I wonder if anybody has any insight. Is it getting better? Because it doesn't seem like it's getting better. If you talk to people that are deep in the weeds on it, anybody have thoughts on that?
We don't see it getting better. I mean, let me be clear about this. Thus far, that's not a forecast.
Yeah.
We haven't seen it getting better. If anything, we've seen it getting worse. But we and other companies are trying to be more aggressive about identifying it and surfacing it. We're trying to surface it in all our measurement products, and I'll be honest, it doesn't make us popular because people don't, it's bad news, right? People don't like to hear the bad news. But I think that the first step in this is shining a light on it. You've done an excellent job of that in the work that you've done. You guys have all read his stuff on fraud, I'm sure. We're working to shine a light on it in our reported products, and I think that that's the first step in raising our collective consciousness, so we start to understand the impact, the scope of it, and then we can, you know, sort of work together to wipe it out. I applaud the IAB's optimism, but I think we're a ways away from getting our hands around it.
Just to build on Josh's point, I think one of the other things that's happening, and this is actually something that Google's doing with ComScore, is tackling this at the ad serving level. So it's one thing to shine a light on fraud. The second thing is to identify it not retroactively, but proactively.
Right.
And there's now solutions through these partnerships where you can address it at the moment that ad is potentially served.
One last thing is that we're about to wrap up, and I think I'll start with you, but there's a lot of talk lately about we need to prove the brand efficacy of online advertising. It's a business that's been dominated by direct response for so long, and we want to prove the branding works. And I know Google is pushing this initiative to do a lot more consumer surveys. Facebook's pushing this hard. Maybe you guys could talk about, is there some optimism there, and that's going to be something that can be standard and mechanized in a big way, or how far away from we proving that brand advertising works all the time?
Yeah, I don't think we're too far away. We certainly haven't solved it. I would say that, and I came from the brand world, Coca-Cola, we still had to sell cases of Coke. So The challenge is in the digital space, how do you connect a big initiative like the happiness, spot that went on the Super Bowl the other night to selling Coke at 7-Eleven? And there's going to be different stages. We've seen a lot of luck with things like awareness and ad recall by looking at search lift. And then for more sort of traditional middle of funnel type metrics, we'll do consumer surveys, which again have proven well. And then for the brands that are selling online, let's say through Amazon or Google Shopping, we can then measure the conversion too. So I think we're getting there. I think we've actually made a lot of good progress. We still have a ways to go.
Are we overly enamored in this industry with consumer surveys? Does anybody ever answer consumer surveys?
I don't know if we're overly enamored, but I will tell you as a consumer that I get asked to participate, I think, in way too many surveys. Yeah.
All right, on that high note, I'll wrap it up. Thanks, guys, for terrific discussion. I appreciate your time.
Thank you.
Thank you.
We're now going to move into our agency trading desk panel. Really excited about this discussion today. Our moderator is Joanna O'Connell, who's the Director of Research at AdExchanger and is widely considered one of the true experts with a deep understanding and knowledge of programmatic trading. Joanna joined AdExchanger as Director of Research in September 2013 to develop proprietary research on the future of marketing technology and be the voice of the marketer in a rapidly evolving ecosystem. Prior to AdExchanger, Joanna served as the Principal Analyst at Forrester Research for over 3 years, serving marketing professionals and covering programmatic digital media buying, audience and data management, and multi-channel measurement. Joanna has 13 years of experience in the interactive marketing industry, beginning her career at Avenue A in New York, later serving as a founding member of Razorfish's Adams Systems Agency, her trading desk, and more recently running brand relations for the Audience on Demand practice at VivaKi. Joanna has been featured on NPR, a frequent speaker and panelist, and we welcome Joanna and our esteemed panel to the stage. Let's give it up. Thanks.
Such a long bio, I'm sorry. I told him not to read the whole thing. All right. We were supposed to have another smart, awesome lady on stage with us, but her flight was canceled. So we do not have our Mnet representative, which is a big bummer. Can you guys just real briefly introduce yourselves, and then we'll come back and we'll talk about what you all do and what your organizations do.
I'm Marco Bertozzi. I'm president of VivaKi Audience on Demand across EMEA and the US Client Services.
Okay, thanks, Marco.
Morning, I'm Adam Kasper, Chief Media Officer, Havas Media North America. I oversee a bunch of things in the agency, one of which is the trading desk.
Hi, good morning. I'm Arun Kumar. I'm the Global President of Cadreon, which is the programmatic unit for media brands.
Hello, I'm Brian Gleason. I'm the CEO of Xaxis across the Americas.
Cool. So now I'm going to have you guys actually explain what each of your orgs do and kind of what the component parts are. You know, is it all service? Is there any proprietary tech? You know, where do you sit? That kind of thing.
Okay, so within Publicis, we've just had a bit of a shift around, and now really VivaKi is aligned very much with the two big media agencies, Zenfox Media and Starcom MediaVest. VivaKi is split into VivaKi Exchange, which is not to be confused with sort of exchange inventory. It's the joint trading, the aggregation of spend between those two agencies. And VivaKi Operating System, which is all the infrastructure that really supports programmatic and audience on demand.
How come it's called Exchange? That doesn't seem confusing. That was not your decision.
Not my decision.
No. Okay. Seems confusing. Okay. Thanks, Marco.
So at Havas, we've approached building the trading desk, I think, a little bit differently than some of the other holding companies. The way we've done it is while AFIPERF, which is the name of the trading group. I promised Joanna I wasn't going to say trading desk.
Yeah, you did already. Yep.
We've built the trading group, while it's owned by Havas wholly, it sits within the agencies from a physical standpoint and from a strategic standpoint. So as opposed to being kind of an outside group that is highly aligned with the agencies, we actually have traders sitting in each of the agencies, aligned to individual teams and aligned to specific clients. For us, that works really well because we're able to gain insight into what each of the different strategies are for different clients and become very familiar and become experts at their business.
Actually, you know, before Arun, all service, any proprietary tech?
Yeah.
I want to ask you that.
Yeah. So from the trading tech standpoint, we use third parties, but recently we've developed our own essentially workflow and decisioning platform that sits over on top of all DSPs that we use, so we can use multiple DSPs within individual campaigns and use the same targeting data to enable that.
Got it. And Marco, can we back up and service?
Yeah, I mean, so two elements. One's the AOD platform, originally titled the AOD platform, which in a similar fashion, because we're all probably struggling to do the same thing, which is aggregate all the data from all the many and varied DSPs that we use. And that's a global tool for any of our agencies or clients, or indeed the AOD people to log into to see their activity anywhere in the world.
So it's like not to be reductionist, but it's like a reporting and insights portal?
Reporting and insights, yeah. It does a few other things, but basically.
Okay.
And then obviously SMG bought Run recently,
yep.
And Run will bring a lot of interesting infrastructure from for a DMP and also from a cross-device ID perspective. But we're at the very early stages of incorporating that.
Yeah, that's so interesting. I forgot that I wanted to ask you about that. We might not have time.
Yeah, so Cadreon started off as a programmatic unit in 2008. We sort of had a shift in strategy. We moved under Magna, which is the buying arm for IPG. It integrates media buys across both UM and Initiative, which are the media agencies. And there are 3 or 4 components of this. There's obviously the campaign management teams that sit in Magna in a market, which actually run strategy and campaigns for clients, which are aligned to specific clients. We then have a global product and technology team, which is based out of San Francisco, which is focused on developing our product across platforms. We use third-party technologies. Our focus primarily is on how we integrate them. We do have our own proprietary data stack, and then we obviously have our own analytics tools as well. So that's the team that's based in SF. We then obviously have a marketplace team that looks at how we increase inventory flows into the programmatic pipeline. And these teams support the whole world, but they're based in the US.
Did you say proprietary data stack?
Yes.
Okay, we'll probably come back to that. We will come back to that. Brian?
Sure. Xaxis, and I'll always start this because we do, is not a trading desk. We sit inside of WPP. We're a programmatic media company. So it's a little bit unique when you think about our business. There's 3 ways to access what we do. One is through straight up supply. We're available on the exchanges. The other would be on an IO basis for any of our products. And the third would be as a managed service. We operate within WPP, but roughly 25% of my revenue comes outside of WPP, that we support clients directly and independent agencies. It's all built on top of proprietary tech. That is what we deemed or introduced this last year, which is Turbine. We also have a relationship which we formed this year with AdNexus, where we actually own 15% of AdNexus. And again, so it's a little bit unique in how...
And they got the ad server, yeah?
They did, yeah. But we still, again, you think about tech stack, we have on our team, we still have 140 engineers. So it's unique to, as we all know, a holding company to be able to have and keep those resources. It's a different type of organization.
Is that a buzzsaw?
Yeah, that's our engineers. They're working here. JWT is part of WPP, right?
The last time I had a couple of these guys on stage, there was like this sound, and the whole room had to be cleared. So I'm like, is it us? Like, what is it about this group of people? Okay, you said 25% comes outside of WPP?
Correct.
You said clients direct and independent agencies?
Yes.
Do you guys ever work with like networks or other kinds of entities as clients?
No, you would, network relationship would be if we're surfacing up inventory. So if,
What does that mean?
So Xaxis has tags on the pages with over 1,000 different URLs or publishers. If we're accessing that inventory and we pull it and they buy that on the open market.
Interesting.
Yeah,
You are so different than the rest of these guys.
We
Everybody
love
get, what's that?
So, but we love them all.
I mean, yeah, I hope so. They're all very smart fellows. I love them all personally. Okay, so let's talk about this holding company relationship that you all have. Benefits of being inside of a holding company, and then challenges that come with being inside of a holding company. In any order, I hate going down the line, so somebody else.
I'll start with it. There's massive benefits in what you think for infrastructure. So we're in 42 different markets. There's no way if we were a startup venture back that we'd ever be able to do that, because simply the manpower to be able to go out, you wouldn't have the offices to be able to do it. We wouldn't, so there's benefits that come from that. We get a check every 2 weeks. If we were a startup, that would probably be a different situation in how you think about that business. The challenge is we're a media company that sits inside of an agency. So a lot of that discussion happens is simply before we get to tell how we can help a client, we have to introduce what our model is, where we sit and what we do, which would be different than if we were a standalone entity. So overall, I think there's tremendous gain that comes from it. It's also, I have the full heft of WPP buying power, which I wouldn't have if I was a standalone entity, which means I probably wouldn't get the leverage we had.
It's interesting because you said we're a media company that sits inside of an agency, right? Do the rest of you guys think of yourselves as agency people? Because I don't think that the Xaxis folks really think of them. I mean, you don't think of yourself as an agency person.
Yeah,
I mean, certainly Brian Lesser
doesn't.
doesn't.
I worked in an agency.
What's that?
Yeah, this is my first agency job.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay.
I personally do very much.
Yeah.
But my business card says Havas Media, which is an agency, not Afterperf, which is that word that I won't say.
Yeah. So you have you're a little different than these guys.
Yeah.
What is your relationship to the holding company?
From the trading team standpoint.
Yeah. I mean, just like the way you're doing your day-to-day job, the whole who manages what from a programmatic standpoint.
Very tied into the holding company.
They're very French. You have to deal with that.
Exactly. It's a wonderful thing.
We'll have to deal with that.
It's true.
Tell some stories. No, but we're very much collectively part of the holding company approach, and I would say that the direction that comes from the holding company leadership on a global level is given to both the agency and the trading desk in terms of kind of strategic vision. So, and the two are aligned. There's not any kind of divergent
Are you
approaches.
being nice or for real?
No, not necessarily. I mean,
okay.
No, really though. The trading desk has been built to service the agency and its clients, and that's really the whole reason for its being. And it's not, currently the model, at least at our company, is not to to go out and find additional revenue at other agencies or other companies and that kind of thing.
It's 100%.
Absolutely.
I have some sympathy with Brian and Brian, the other Brian.
The other Brian.
About not wanting to be on some of these panels or not wanting to call trading desk. And actually, I was sort of supportive of that because I see Xaxis as as an ad network. I mean, I know you're an audience company, whatever you want to call it, but I do see it as something completely different. And actually that has, in my view, muddied the waters for all of what we would describe as a more traditional agency sort of central team within an agency group. And I think that's been the problem right from the start, that actually they are different models, and yet we tend to all sit on the same panels talking about the same thing when we do it quite differently. But and I think but to the original point of being in an agency group, the fact remains that there are certain things that the agencies need to put their own flavour on, and they have to design it to fit in with what they're doing. And so within VivaKi now, we are on that road towards those skill sets being more within the agency, more embedded in the agency. The
actual VivaKi people, sorry, Marco, I didn't mean
well,
to
they would,
interrupt.
I guess they are currently VivaKi people, but they would become agency people.
Oh, okay.
But we're on that we're on that journey. But there are still many things that it is completely inefficient. And if you're an advertiser, I really wouldn't want my agencies to be going off and each doing it themselves. And that is where the VivaKi operating system is focused, is on those areas that we can build at the center that really just go to support the strategy and execution of the agencies.
What kind of stuff would that be?
So that's the AOD platform, that's our work around VivaKi Verified, all the verification stuff, the channel solutions, all the things that you don't have to do multiple times. You can do them once centrally. And that's our view, and then that should power the agencies to do their flavor of programmatic.
So still centralized as a group, but maybe starting to decentralize physically? Is that the right way to think about it?
I think it's clear to everyone that the skill sets of programmatic shouldn't really now be contained in a standalone business unit, right? Because programmatic is going to be everything, just like digital when it grew up became part of everything. So, and we're fully aligned now with the agencies and underneath the agency group. So we're inevitably going to start that journey of making sure those skill sets are in the agency rather than separated out.
And for you guys, I mean, you've been physically decentralizing that stuff for a little while inside of Cadreon, correct?
So I would put it as, I would start with the challenges, and I would say that it's a big management challenge.
Okay.
And the reason why it's a big management challenge is if you look at our product dev crew in San Francisco, that's about 60 people.
Mm-hmm.
They come from the Valley, they come from enterprise software companies. They bring a totally different culture, a totally different approach to problem solving. They are used to working in startups, they're used to working with speed. They want to turn around products very quickly. They want to try and test, and then if it doesn't work, they just shrug and they move on. And then on the other side, you've got the trading teams, the teams that run campaigns that are in the marketplace trying to get inventory deals. Trying to get the platforms folks to agree with the trading folks on what are the platform's strengths and weaknesses is a huge task, because that, again, is a trading approach is a totally different approach. But where this starts to get interesting, and that's where the opportunity lies within a holding company, is if you're able to spawn off the idea behind programmatic, that it is disruptive, it changes the way you approach media, right up to the way you look at audience segments and plan, not just the way you buy. And when you get those people aligned, it's an amazing rush to see that change happen, because then it ripples right through the organization. You see teams changing. You see the skill sets of the people in the media agencies change, because the CEOs finally start to get the kind of skills they need to be hiring for. So it is a huge management challenge to get all these cultures together, and there's always a balance between them.
I mean, because the reality is, of course, right, disruption can be exciting, and disruption can also be very painful.
So it's about how you manage the disruption, and yes, there are days when that disruption is clearly something which you wish didn't take place. But I think we're getting to a point now where, in the past, programmatic was a silo, and it was seen as, okay, there's this bunch of folks who are doing this cool stuff, let them do it, we'll get on with everything else. That's completely changed. It's at the center of every client conversation. It therefore means we're at the center of every client conversation. It's about the way we're starting to have conversations with other broadcast channels on how to bring them and connect them into the pipeline, which means our whole approach towards leadership has changed. So it's more leadership by influence rather than leadership by command and control, where you say, I'm the siloed unit, and this is the way I'm going to behave.
Yeah, I mean, I remember in the early days, the desks, as they were generally called back then, tended to be behind the scenes. Are you guys all spending more time with clients, sort of directly in contact with them, explaining this stuff, maybe even talking about performance?
Yeah,
is it more direct?
Quite a bit. In fact, we've done a couple things to overcome that challenge, because it really is, having that programmatic knowledge is one thing. Being able to translate that programmatic knowledge into language that planners and clients can really understand is totally something different. So what we've done is we've built an organization that's essentially like a management organization for the trading desk that kind of sits between the trading desk and the account teams, the media teams who are making the decisions, so that they're able to kind of facilitate those transactions and drive better strategies and that the trading teams will understand, as opposed to a brief that might come through that gives you kind of a broad demographic, age demographic to target or something like that. So there's, it's really, you really need a lot of very specific attention paid to that communication that goes on between the client or the client representative and the traders themselves. And so we found that to be pretty successful. And then the other thing that we've done that I think has really helped a lot is just hiring programmatic talent or people with programmatic experience into our day-to-day account and media team. So it's not just consolidated into one area of the agency, but rather spread out throughout all our offerings.
I think there's just the regional difference has been, in Europe, all the AD people have been in front of clients from day one, all of the time. And that helps because we're often in one building, everyone's within 1 mile in London, so that has just been a natural part. I think in the US, we've tried to do that as much as we can, but just because of scale and geographical differences, and the agencies are much bigger and sort of separated, I think AOD or trading desks generally have slightly fallen behind the scenes and become more like an ad network relationship.
Well, yeah, I mean, that was the original model. The original model was trading desks, client was agency, whose client was marketer. And it feels like that's shifting.
I don't think we ever wanted that, though, to be honest. I think because the
Except
more
it was
educated...
the message, which I don't think
well,
wasn't
maybe.
right? But that was...
If you look at the craft example, the world's changed. And I think clients are demanding that, hey, addressability works, we should be front and center with these discussions. So rather than be behind the scenes, what we find is from day one, whether it be any new pitch or engagement, addressability is part of that. And generally, we're involved in those discussions. Any quarterly business review, we're generally there because the core premise behind what all of us do, it really is changing how media is bought and sold. So, and I think we all agree that there's a complexity to that, which takes a centralized group to be able to speak to. So lots of times we're pulled into it, and it's not talking about small things. And it may not necessarily even be talking about programmatic. It's talking about, hey, how do you change our business? What can we actually do? What can we see that we couldn't have seen before? And those are conversations which you don't just wheel out once a year, I don't think, and say, oh, here you go. It's an ongoing dialogue.
I think the way clients see us is we're seen as the incubators of ad tech, and that has implications on planning, on data, on analytics, on a huge canvas. I would say that the number of meetings that I have with clients every quarter doubles over the previous quarter. There's more and more demand for clients saying, we want to speak to the programmatic teams which are working on our business. We want to understand what is it that you're doing and how does it impact some of the direct deals that I'm doing, and how do I, because we're still in this world where programmatic is thought of separately. We're going to get to a place where you might trade differently, but the principles behind programmatic are going to drive everything. So therefore, we're getting called into conversations where it may not actually be about a programmatic buy, but it might just be, what do we do with our first-party data, for instance? Yeah. So we see ourselves as, how do we leverage tech to be able to drive data-driven audience targeting? And that would mean that sometimes our media agencies benefit from our expertise. It's more about democratizing our tradecraft. And the moment you do that, clients want to speak to you. So.
Well, you know what's interesting about Craft is that Craft and Starcom have come to a really good place. They have a very strong partnership. But Craft essentially demanded that Starcom turn over like 60% of that team. And to Starcom's credit, they said, yes, we want to make you happy. We believe in this relationship. We will do that for you. But it was hugely disruptive, I think. They were looking for very specific kinds of skills on their business to be able to bring this whole data as unfair competitive advantage to life, and that took a huge amount of change with the agency, within the agency. So that's just a side note on that. But now let's talk about data. I love that, data as unfair competitive advantage. How are you seeing clients think about data management in this world of DMPs, in this world of the rise of first-party data? Are you finding that they're tending to go to their agencies and say, help me with this, give me some sort of tool to do this, or will you please put this inside of your giant repository and do it for me because you understand it better? Or are you finding them tending to say, no, we're going to go out, we're going to get our own DMP relationship in place, and then you agency and agency partners can access it?
Well, look, I wouldn't mind jumping ahead through the kind of the bit we're at now, where
Okay.
there are lots of different examples of people. I think the end result for advertisers is they are more than likely going to have ownership of their DMP, right? The DMP will be their one consistent. I was with a big global client last week, and it was interesting because they've got different agencies of record in different countries. This happened to be in Europe, but it can be a global. They had different agencies in different countries. Those agencies were using different DSPs, different deals with different media owners and so on. And you look at that and you go, well, that's pretty complex. But the one consistent that they could really own and grab would be a DMP, right? And each of those countries, each of those DSPs can have their access to that DMP, their instance to work with the sets of data that effectively that client lets them work with. So, I think we're going to go through some experimentation. I think the agencies are going to provide DMPs. I think the clients are going to have their own. But I think long term, medium term, maybe I should say, the clients are going to have that ownership because that's the one consistent that they can work with. That's not to say they don't need help, right? And I think we talk about data a lot. There's really two things. When we talk about data, there's two parts to it. We have something called Skyscraper, which is the data warehousing for all of this data, right? And it's Atlas data and double-click data and all the DSP data and spend data and all this sort of stuff. That is a lot of data that just needs to be housed, organized, and managed. DMP data, audience data, is very different. So, clients need to own that audience data and understand the audience data. There's loads of heavy lifting around everything, all the spend, transactional data, as we call it. Don't necessarily need to own that. They could probably do some help on that.
And are they setting up feeds and pulling that then into their particular?
Either them or the agencies can do that.
Yeah.
Right? So that's just how I think things. It's going to be their one common denominator, and especially in a world where we're dealing with a few DSPs really right now. But if you want to buy Yahoo, you're going to use their DSP. If you want to buy AOL, you're going to use their DSP. If you want to buy Facebook, you're going to use their DSP, and so on and so forth. And all of these DSPs are going to be chaos. So the DMP will be the thing that joins it all up.
I'm curious, Brian, for you guys, because I think you've invested a huge amount in your data infrastructure, which is not to say the rest of us haven't. But
I completely agree with Marco in the sense that I think that clients are going to own their data, especially the large ones. And I think the idea of, when you think about a central repository, DMP, our job is activation. So everything we think about is, if you're a client and your data sits in a silo, challenge is how do I connect that with the rest of the world? And that's where we look at it. If you think about Turbine at its core, everything we're trying to do is predictive models. So it's one thing about being, okay, great, I have addressability, I know who this individual is, but then how can I make a nimble decision on where that media goes? Our premise is we have to be ubiquitous in terms of where we link in with other DMPs. If a smaller client wants us to be able to handle that, absolutely we could for them. But that's not, our business isn't a DMP business. Our business is an activation business. And that's the way that we approach it. And then the next thing would be insights that sit on top of that. So the challenge that we have now is you have these multiple silos that we look to is how do I come back, and it's almost, you think about the role of the agency, strategy is more important than it's ever been because it's more complex than it's ever been. So we've made this notion of, okay, great, what if a client took a DMP and a DSP in-house? Well, that's a challenge, right? So you can own your data, but then how do you operate on a global scale to be able to do that?
yeah, which maybe, Adam, I would like to ask you your perspective on this because I think of the four of these guys, you have the most, I hate to use the word traditional, but most sort of agency-oriented kind of position.
Yep.
So,
Fair.
how do you think about this stuff? If the client owns the data, what role is the agency or group of agencies playing?
I mean, what we've seen is most of our big clients, and especially those clients who are reliant on data, have strong DR businesses and that type of thing, are absolutely going about it and being the contractual owner of the relationship with the DMP. And I agree with these guys. That's absolutely the right thing for them to do. What we've done, though, is really try and be the shepherd of this process for them and essentially act as the consultant in their decisioning process for which one they choose based on what their parameters are and that kind of thing. So, we'll help them send out the RFI. We'll literally sit in the pitch meetings with them with the DMP partners and listen and give recommendations and scorecards and that kind of thing to help push them towards the right decision.
It feels like a change from, a few years ago. I have to give the agency folks credit here because I think in the early days of companies like VivaKi, it was some innovative agency folks that were pushing their clients to allow them to use these tools to do things like centralize data and make data more useful and easier to use. And there has been this shift, it feels like, and so it's interesting to hear how you guys are talking about shepherding the client through it, but recognizing that the client's going to own that relationship.
Yeah, in many cases, we operate it for them. They just want that.
Oh, they have the contractual relationship.
They have the contract.
But you are managing it.
I mean, the DMP will obviously take in many different sets of data.
Sure.
Not all of it is advertising targeting data. And some of it is related to their CRM systems and that type of thing. So, but we'll be the managers of the data that is used for targeting engagement.
And media.
Yep, exactly.
Yep.
We've actually gotten to a position where we're trying to get clients to take ownership of it, even if they initially didn't want to. The reason is, so when we start talking to them about, so what do you want your data to do for you? Where are you coming from? Are you coming from, you have an e-commerce business and so a site-based DMP is what you're looking for? Or are you looking for efficiencies through media data, so that's a media-based DMP? Are you looking for an agnostic DMP? And then as you start having that conversation and they start realizing that the impact is much bigger, then we start telling them, we can help you set this up. But if this really needs to work, this needs to be plugged in everywhere. And I think what we're all saying is we're going to get to the place where clients are going to have their own DMPs. They should. And we see ourselves as architects and designers and sort of helping them navigate this data ecosystem for them to understand what's the best value that they can get out of it. And yes, there are clients, a lot of them turn around and say, now that we've figured out what we need to do, we want you to operate it, which is fine. But we don't want to, we don't want clients to say, well, we'll handle everything. And that's just it.
You don't want them abdicating responsibility for data ownership. So let's talk a little bit about data quality, data transparency, pricing of data. This is something I'm hearing more and more from the marketers that I talk to. Frustrations over lack of transparency in segments that they're buying, licensed segments that they're buying, or concerns over the pricing and how the pricing is developed and whether the pricing is appropriate. So, as the pendulum has swung from it's all about third-party data to it's all about first-party data to somewhere in the middle, what's happening in the data market? How are you guys navigating it? What's good, what's not?
Well, I mean, VivaKi Verified has always been our vehicle for all things data tech and inventory. So data fits into that. The primary role of the verification process is to put the data providers through the various standards to make sure they're operating in the way they should be, they're collecting the data in the correct fashion, refreshing it.
That's a standardized process that you follow?
That is a standardized process, yeah.
And that's something
it's different for technology as it is for data as it is for inventory, but it comes under the wider scope of whatever we ask our advertisers to engage in, whether it's tech inventory or data, it's been through various validations. So we only work with a number of DSPs, for instance, because they've passed this verification
Do a lot
process.
of companies fail?
Well, there's, I'm not going to name it.
You don't have to.
I know this is on camera, but there's a couple of very well-known big DSPs that we don't work with, full stop, because they haven't passed it.
How about data providers, where it's a big, well-known data provider, but you've discovered that it's all junk?
They tend to be, this is their business. It's less the big, well-known ones. It's weeding out the smaller, slightly more innovative companies and making sure that they're adhering. It's not that they're even doing it sometimes out of, they're trying to do it on purpose, but maybe they haven't quite got the resources to make sure they're doing everything they should be. But then, so that's our process, and that's something we hold on dearly, and we've done it from the start. I think from a pricing perspective, that's a simple one for us because all data is pass-through costs. So whatever we pay, they pay.
And that's not really my issue, I think, or the marketer's issue. It's how is the price come up with? Is it appropriate? So maybe not so much how you guys are pricing it because you're passing it through, but how the providers are pricing it. Do you guys anybody else have thoughts on any of these things? I'm sure you do. You have processes like...
Yeah, I would say, I think data verification as a whole is a challenge. So to the fact of someone says this is an auto intender, how do you really know what that actually is until you go out to the market and see how it performs? Now you can validate the standards of who the company is and how they collect, but actually matching it up is a challenge. For us, we use very few third-party data providers. I think pricing is an issue when you get to that, simply because we're all bidding on the same impression. So if it's one third-party data pool that we're all bidding on, it's a challenge to be able to look to it. That's the majority of why we've tried to build in-house those activation pools and whatnot.
Yeah, some of these issues feel like they're the same issues that we had 5 or 6 years ago. How do you know that you're not buying the same user into an auto-intender pool?
Publishers have come into the last 2 years or 18 months, publishers have got a lot smarter about how we use their data and how we work with them. So I think they've brought I agree with Brian as far as the hardcore third-party data segments. You know, they are pretty standardized. I think publishers have added a new ingredient, and the whole private marketplace stuff is obviously always associated with inventory, but it's actually data as well. And that's where you can start to mix different ingredients depending on your relationship with publishers and depending on the client. Because every client should be different.
It's actually happening now? Like second-party data relationships are happening?
So some of the big data providers, if you look at a segment like auto-intenders, we know that a couple of them, we will never work with them because we've run them, we've verified them, and we've seen they're not auto-intenders.
How do you do that? Can you talk about that?
So we work very closely with our clients who have first-party data. And then also they have very well-developed relationships with publishers. It's a lot more easy in some of these segments to verify some of these. And we found that and so we've got clear, which is what the central team does. And therefore our process is that none of the teams in markets can use a data provider for a particular segment unless it's been verified by us.
Really?
And the challenge also is that when let's say you did a global deal and what you find is it works very well in the US, and then you go to some of the other markets, let's say in Europe or Asia, and actually the quantity and quality of data is really not up to the mark. So then you have to look at other things like how do you mine your own ad server data, identify what are the sites which, for example, have never turned out a response in the last 1 year of campaigns, and then identify that as a bot, and you build local sets around them so that you then go to a client and say, we can actually target and we will leave out these sites or these URLs because we believe they're bots or whatever. And it's the same thing with data. We don't believe that you should work with these providers in these markets. It is a painful process, but it has.
I was going to say, it sounds painful and manual and very specific for each of you. How about for Havas?
Yeah, I mean, for us, it's kind of a two-step process with first, really looking long and hard at the data provider and where they're sourcing this from. I think it's very easy to take things like demographic data, which is probably more stable than intent data, and turn that into intent. So based on certain age or geography, companies start to make the assumption or put into segments that someone is intending to buy a house or someone's intending to buy a car. Based on those simple parameters in many cases. And so our team goes in and looks very closely at this, looks at the sources of the data and tries to kind of vet out what is valid and what's not. The real answer comes in testing it. The real answer comes in putting it into the market.
Which means having good measurement in place. But that's a whole separate conversation.
Absolutely, having measurement
we don't have time for.
Right, that is going to tell you whether this data is good and that's agreed to across the board.
So I could talk to you guys all day, as you know, but I think we only have a few minutes left. So can we talk about television? Because my current obsession is with television. And I was really interested in understanding what this thing called programmatic television really was. And by the way, it's not really. I mean, it's a misnomer, right? You've got two big things happening. You've got some automation of manual processes, and you have some, I would say, deeper modeling to find better matches between niche shows and audiences. Right? That's kind of what's happening, like a simul.
I mean, there's so many different angles.
Right? And then there's addressable. There is some addressable stuff, and there's over the top. What are you guys all doing with television? Where does programmatic television live inside of your organization?
Our focus has got to be around the data. I mean, less about the automation and the technology,
and more about
the
audience
data.
and data.
There is so much data in these set-top boxes that, obviously there are companies like Rentrack and whatever that are mining it, but there's a lot more besides. And actually SMG, with their precision video unit, are starting to work on some of that non-aggregated data from set-top boxes and using a third party like an Axiom to try and help bring these two elements together. But I think people are really focused on the, you'll see a press release every week from a Turn or from a Videology, all these companies saying, yeah, we do programmatic TV. There's all of that's going on, and there's a big obsession with that. But actually, we've got to release the data, and that is the thing that will really make the big change. The problem is that is something that is going to significantly disrupt the industry, and there's a lot of stakeholders that are going to slow that down.
Yeah, I mean, so are you finding that each of your organizations is creating some kind of, like there's Modi, right? Or
yeah, we have Modi Media that within WPP and Group M does that. And I think the premise is there, which is, from our organization, Arun said, the idea of moving from a 30-second spot to an impression, I think is what everybody looks to. What that path is going to be, depending on the time, like we can't predict it.
Talk about disruption.
Yeah, but to Marco's point is, there is data there. For our view on it, the way that we generally do is we take broadcast and extend. So if you're looking for additional GRPs in addition to your broadcast, that's the area where we live. I think you will move up funnel, but for Videology and others, this is their primary world. So they're looking at the future today.
So I wonder, when Linda Yaccarino at NBC comes out and says, we have this audience targeting platform, we're going to make a third of our inventory sort of audience-oriented into these segments, and we're going to bring it to the upfront. How are we arming our marketers to go into these upfront negotiations knowing what they want? Because I just don't know that they're there yet. Sorry, I moved from where we were, but Arun, you look...
Yeah, starting with the point about where it lives. It lives at the intersection of programmatic and TV. So that's why the fact that Cadreon sits under Magna helps us a lot, because then a marketplace team, when it talks to a TV station, is talking not just from an upfront perspective, but is also talking about data.
Okay.
And I pretty much agree with what everyone else said in the sense that it's all about data. So what we've done is we've worked with Nielsen, Rentrack, and primarily with Experian to co-create our data stack. The primary objective is to try and see how do we do an online-offline match and try and see what's the value of some of the programming. Now, that is something that has implications across all types of TV. It's not an exclusive, what we call advanced TV product. But what it does do is it does give you a little bit more information about the value of, let's say, some of the remnant inventory that's available. At the same time, what we've seen, especially the last time in the upfronts, there was a huge amount of interest from the TV stations. And so we had our programmatic marketplace guys sitting in there in the upfronts from our side while speaking to the TV stations.
Okay.
And
with TV buyers from the agencies?
With TV buyers. And in fact, if you look at what we did with ABC, what they said was, okay, we're willing to do this, but then we need to be able to choose a data partner that we're comfortable with. So it then comes down to, you then sort of architect a solution where they're comfortable that their inventory is not going to get undervalued, or what is the data that you're using, or what is it that you're collecting. And I think that's the way we go about it. It's still early days. I don't think it's anywhere close to where it should be. But I think I absolutely agree. It's the data that will power this. And I think the actual trading bit, it may never get to what people expect it to be, like a truly programmatic marketplace.
I think it will.
But
it's going to take some time.
It's interesting. I'm not sure, because there's ultimately there will be such a resistance to putting, truly premium television programming through anything but a human-to-human negotiation. And I think it's going to be very hard to kind of wrestle that away from the networks, essentially. That said, obviously, the vast majority of probably what's on cable and local programming is already very ripe to go through those channels. The funny thing is about programmatic TV in general is every single person in this room would have a different definition for it. Right? It's like it means a million, and it means a million different things. Because it could mean finding better targeting on traditional television. It could mean sending ads through streaming, devices, that kind of thing. So, really tough in terms of actually even agreeing about what we're talking about versus, being able to come to one cohesive opinion on it.
One of the things that has happened, though, with all this focus is that you can then start to look at, let's say, a segment like millennials and the fact that they are low or non-existent TV viewers. and then you use that data to see where do you target them online programmatically, so that you're able to plug holes in the TV schedule.
To Brian's point, right?
Those are the ways by which I think
Extension, complement, yeah. All right, I wish we had more time, but I think we're out. Thank you all very much.
Thank you.
Super interesting.
Thank you.
Thank you. When you talk about a dedicated person and a dedicated public servant, I want to personally thank Commissioner Brill for making the effort to do this. That's great.
You're really sweet.
Because otherwise you'd be hearing about my summer vacation, which would be very boring.
That's not what I've heard about your summer vacations.
That's true. So this is a great opportunity for the industry to hear from one of the leading thinkers on the issues that this conference has been about. And what we're going to do in terms of format is just, I'll raise some questions to Commissioner Brill, who will then expound upon her thoughts, and we'll kind of move from there. If we have time at the end, I know this is a very compressed conference because your time is all valuable, everyone's time is valuable. We may not have some time for Q&A, but if we do, we will. So just to start it off, Commissioner Brill, we can make the assumption some of the people here know what the FTC's role is in the area of data privacy and security. Could you speak a little bit about the FTC and its role?
Sure. So, and again, thanks to 4A's for inviting me. I always love interacting with industry to help explain why we take the positions we take. And frankly, I get as much out of it by hearing back from industry as I hope I can give to you. So the FTC is the nation's leading consumer protection agency. There are others who focus on certain verticals, but we are the one that is sort of the broadest and does the most in the most sectors. And within our consumer protection mandate, we also do competition enforcement, by the way. Within our consumer protection enforcement mandate, we cover privacy and data security. We do lots of enforcement. We enforce both sector-specific laws, and then we also enforce sort of our general law that prohibits unfair and deceptive acts and practices. And it's within that realm, that general law, that we have brought 50 data security cases. Actually, I think we're at like 55 now. And over 40 privacy cases. So we're rounding up to about 100 over the past decade or so. We also, though, we don't just do law enforcement. One of the ways that our agency was set up was so that we could also engage in policy discussions. We could do deep dives into various sectors of industry, whether it's through issuing subpoenas and doing reports or just holding workshops and issuing guidances. So we've done a lot of education and policy development in the privacy and data security space in particular.
And when you think about the activities of the FTC on the enforcement basis, could you talk a little bit more in detail in terms of some of the specifics of what you've done?
Right. So we do focus on data security, and we also focus on privacy. And it's funny, I actually think that it used to be that we sort of looked at them very separately in some ways. We started out doing data security and really hit hard on that for about 5 or so years. And then we sort of moved into privacy. But now I'm sort of seeing what's really interesting is a blending of those two issues. And I've always believed that privacy and data security are two sides of the same coin. I mean, you can't have privacy unless you have data security. And some of our cases are really demonstrating that in particular. So for instance, we brought a case against Snapchat. I don't know if they're here. I know half of you or more of you use it. But we brought a case against Snapchat because it hadn't lived up to its promise that its snaps would be ephemeral. And so that was a privacy promise, but the way in which folks were able to retain the snaps, it actually led to some security issues. So that's just one of many examples of how the two issues really do overlap. So data security is one of our big efforts, and it's going to be growing even more as we move into the Internet of Things, which I hope we have time to talk about. Mobile, huge issue when it comes to, especially when it comes to privacy. Mobile devices collect a huge amount of information. You guys are probably using a lot of it. There are some real privacy issues to the extent that consumers are not given adequate information and control over the collection of geo and contact lists and things like that. And we've brought cases in that area too, where either consumers were not informed at all, or they were informed inadequately, or they were told they would be able to make certain choices, and those choices were not effective. And that was particularly true also with respect to something that may be of interest to you in the tracking space. You know, we have brought cases where consumers were told that they would be able to turn off tracking or limit tracking, but in fact those choices were not effective or were not as broad as consumers were told. So I know that that's something that's important to you all, you know, whether it's cookie-based, whether it's fingerprinting, whether it's cross-device, whether it's history sniffing, whatever it is you're doing, you need to be upfront with consumers and honest about what their choices are. And frankly, we think it's a best practice to give them effective control over that. Data brokers, big issue for us. You all are probably big clients of data brokers. Some of you may actually be, in a sense, a data broker if you're an ad network or working closely with an ad network. We did a report about data brokers, very important issue. Again, like ad networks, operating behind the scenes. Consumers don't know who they are. They don't know if these entities offer any control or privacy options of any kind. Consumers have no idea how to get to them. So we've made recommendations that build on something that I actually began calling for over a year ago. As you know, Ron, I called it Reclaim Your Name. I think that data brokers and other third-party collectors need to get a lot more creative about how they give information to consumers. So creating immersive portals, creating immersive websites, using the command centers that are now going to be controlling our devices in the home or on our grids or elsewhere. These are all options, and really good options, for in an immersive and meaningful way telling consumers what data is being collected and what controls they have over it. And I think unless we start doing those kinds of things, we're going to really lose consumer trust. And we're sort of on a precipice, I believe, in terms of the trust issue. And that's why I really encourage industry to start thinking much more deeply, meaningfully, and creatively about how to build consumer trust. We also do a lot of work in the international sphere, and I don't know if we'll have time to talk about that, but to the extent that any of you are involved in global transfers, we are the agency that enforces the US-EU safe harbor. And there's been a lot of discussion about that too, and so I'm happy to talk about that again if we've got time.
Great. I mean, one of the things just to be aware of, and some of you are, is that, as you can see the way Commissioner Brill speaks about this, she's very open and very transparent in trying to reach and communicate not only the specifics of what's being done, but the thinking behind it, because what you are working on typically is leading edge plus. And therefore, you can't react to that based upon what they have done, and the FTC is trying to, in fact, reacting to what you might be doing and where you're going, and that's why there's an outreach, that's why there are these workshops, that's why there's communication, so that there is this level of understanding as to what's going on. The earlier part of the sessions today, which have been excellent, have been about really the sophisticated use of data that allows businesses to be competitive in the marketplace. And this session, not that this is a little bit of dose of medicine along with the sugar that was discussed, is really to say, that's fine, but you need to think about the other elements of part of that. And you might not think about that because that might be some of the issues in terms of what the consumer-facing elements are, but there are elements as it relates to the infrastructure and design, and that's going to be critical. So just to step into then the use of the word big data,
right, which
again I think is a word that has been both overused, misused, and it becomes a little bit of a bugaboo. There's big data lying around under your bed. It could either be a positive or negative depending upon what you're speaking about. But from the government's perspective and whatever big data is or is not, what is your perspective and what are the concerns, and to the extent to which you can, what are some of the other agencies' concerns?
Sure. So there's been a lot of discussion about big data in Washington. You know, before I get to what we've done at the FTC, the White House issued a report. The President's Council on Scientific and Technology Advisors issued a report. We did a deep dive into data brokers, and we also held a workshop on big data, whether it can be a tool for inclusion or exclusion. And so I think there's a number of conversations that are going on in Washington, and frankly, I think around the country, and actually around the world, about issues that big data will raise in the privacy and data security space, and also in the fair use of data space. So let me, break those down. One of the issues around big data, a lot of people say, is how can we apply sort of the usual privacy principles of data minimization? How can we apply de-identification? How can we give consumers choice if a lot of this information is being collected behind the scenes, or it's being repurposed from one purpose, the original purpose that it was given, where the consumer gave it up, and it's now being used for a completely different purpose. And we have all these potential benefits with respect to big data. I don't know that many of you are involved in the health vertical, or thinking about the use of big data for health research, but whether it's health, transportation, environmental issues, energy issues, big data has a huge potential to solve some really important societal problems. At the same time, it's really important from our perspective to think not about whether some of these privacy issues apply, but how we're going to apply them in this new space. So for instance, this notion that you're just going to collect everything and figure out what you're going to do with it later because it's got to be worth something. The problem with that is there's two kinds of data security victims that are out there. Those who know that that they've been subject to a breach, and those who are going to be subject to a breach but don't know it yet. I mean, everyone is potentially the subject of a data breach. So you collect all this information personally linkable about individuals, or personally linkable to individuals, or actually identifying individuals in some fashion or another, and then you're subject to a data breach. I mean, it's a huge security problem. And we hear about JP Morgan, we hear about Target, we hear about Home Depot. Ad networks and advertising agencies could just as easily be subject to security breaches. So it's really important that to the extent that you're engaging with linkable information, to be thinking deeply about the data security issues involved. And we have lots and lots of material on our website about recommendations that we make for how to improve data security. One of them, I'll just mention briefly, in addition to data minimization, figure out what do you really need? And if you don't really need something, get rid of it. Because you can't lose or abuse what you don't have. So just get rid of it if you don't need it. But one of the other things that we talk about is de-identification. And de-identification is not simply anonymization. It's not simply, assigning some number to someone that's going to travel across devices and you're going to be able to track them as an individual. Even if you don't know their name, you're going to be able to track them. That is not de-identification. That may be a form of anonymization, but frankly, our perspective is if the information is linkable to a consumer, it's personally identifiable. If it's linkable to a persistent identifier or their device, it is personally identifiable information. That's the way we look at it. So de-identification means robust technical de-identification coupled with a promise that you're not going to try to re-identify the person or the device that you're linking this person to, and that anyone you provide the information to, you're also not going to, you're going to require them to not re-identify the data. And if you do that in a robust way, technical de-identification coupled with these accountability measures, both within the company and then to whomever you're providing the information to, that's the kind of de-identification that kind of takes you out of a lot of the privacy concerns that we have. Because there you're doing absolutely the best you can, from our perspective, to keep that information from being linkable to information, to consumers. But let me turn, so that's data security, a little bit about privacy, although we do think, as I mentioned before, that big data still requires the kind of transparency tools that we were talking about when the data is being used out of the context that the consumer provided it. So a big sort of dividing line is in-context use and out-of-context use. Consumer gives up their information to Target to have a product delivered to them. They know that that information is going to be provided to some service provider that is going to get the product to the consumer. That's an in-context use. But to the extent that that information then moves on and goes to ad networks or to data brokers, that's an out-of-context use. And that's when consumers need to be given effective choices about it. But let me talk a little bit about fairness of data, because that's something that we started to look at too in terms of a workshop that we recently held. And one of the concerns there is, you know, data brokers can classify consumers in many different ways. Ad networks can too. Are these people who like gardening, or are they interested in buying a new car? Those are sort of segments that seem fairly benign. But we also discovered segments which had disturbing names. It really doesn't matter what the name is. What really matters is how are the consumers being classified. So some of these segments were called things like ethnic second city struggler or urban scramble. And you know, to you all, you probably understand what they mean, but it's things like, you know, households where there's a single parent on a low income in an inner city neighborhood. And many of the people that were in these segments were poor, lower income African Americans and Latinos. Now, arguably, that segment could be used as a tool of inclusion, right? A bank could say, look, we've got a new product. We want to try to reach out to the unbanked. It's an entry-level credit card or debit card, whatever it is. We really want to try to reach the right consumers. So in some ways, that segmentation could be very beneficial to this group. But the very same data, the very same list, could be used to, could be given to payday lenders and to other unscrupulous marketers, you know, scam artists and whatnot. And we've had cases just like that, where we had an entity that was a data broker who was collecting information from people who wanted payday loans and was providing some of them to people who were actually providing payday loans, but other lists were just being provided to scam artists. So if you're collecting this information and providing it to others, you need to look at what your clients are doing. You need to look at who you're providing it to. If you yourselves are collecting this kind of information that might be sensitive based on race or income or health, you know, are you collecting information about people who may have an interest in diabetes or an interest in heart condition or may have AIDS or other addictions? You know, we've seen all these kinds of lists. You need to be thinking really carefully about what you're doing with that kind of information, because it is sensitive, and we at the FTC have, as a best practice, said consumers need to be given robust choices, affirmative choices about when that kind of information is going to be collected and used.
I was just going to say, you have anything substantive to say? So, I mean, what you said it stimulates a lot of further questions. We'll kind of move on. Just one thing I do want to say. I mean, I think that when you hear the terminology data brokers, don't think that's not me.
Right.
All right. So it's not capital D, capital B. It's D, small d, small b. In other words, the collection of data, which we all are doing in some form or fashion, and whether or not that then triggers a legal responsibility in some way beyond what you might normally think, that's a question to be discussed. But don't think because you're an ad agency, you're a media, you're a technology provider, whatever it's going to be, and it's somebody else that we're talking about, not necessarily so. The second is, you know, the world is a series of specialized functions and responsibilities. So one of the things that being talked about, Julie was talking about, is saying, okay, let's assume you're collecting this data about minorities and senior citizens, or whomever it might be, and then you're then providing it to a third party. Can you be an ostrich, ignore what the implications are, what you're doing or not as part of that process, because you're doing your specialized function? And the answer is there's been case law historic from the FTC in terms of you might very well have responsibility depending upon your level of involvement as part of that process. So again, don't just think because of your segmentation or the categorization of what you are, I don't have to worry about what they're talking about.
That's a good summary. And some of this isn't, it also might not get you into a legal trap that we or the state AGs or someone else might come after you. But these are just good practices to stay really far away from our radar screen. I mean, to the extent that you want to say, okay, we're in this new world and there are federal agencies that are looking at this and thinking about this, and how do we make sure we're on the right side. You know, if you do the kinds of things that I'm talking about, providing tools and information to consumers, that's going to keep you farther away from the kind of law enforcement actions that we get involved in if someone really does cross the line.
Right. So this event is being brought to you by our friends at the 4A's, which is the American Association of Advertising Agencies, a very well-regarded trade association that does a lot for the industry. So speaking to the advertising agencies, which of course are much different than what they were 20 to 30 years ago, no question, in terms of their function and responsibility. And when we're talking about some of the data implications as part of that, can you speak a little bit to what you see as being uniquely applicable potentially to an advertising agency versus some of the other business lines that we're talking about?
So, I mean, I already spoke a little bit about the need to sort of dive into what you're doing with what kind of data you have, and does it raise some of these sensitivity concerns? And if it does, you know, you use the term "don't be an ostrich," which I love. You know, really, you know, open up that black box. Talk to your technologists. Maybe you guys are the technologists in your firm, but figure out what kind of segmentation are you engaged in, and are you raising, and are you in an area where there's sensitive information being used, and if so, how can you provide more meaningful information to consumers about it? That is going to be one of the really big things. To the extent that you're using data that can be used for financial products, you know, whether consumers can get a loan at a particular rate, insurance products, whether they are going to be offered a certain type of insurance or not offered a certain type of insurance, or at a particular rate, or if you're focused on information that's used in an employment context, these all actually could raise fair credit reporting issues, which is a really interesting law that really does require a lot of technical compliance. So there's a couple of other laws that you need to be aware of. Children's Online Privacy Protection Act. If you're collecting information where you know you've got a kid involved, even if you're not providing a kid-directed service, but if you know that you've got a child under 13 and you've got that child's data, you need to comply with the Children's Online Privacy Protection Act. And we brought a case against Yelp, which is obviously not a kid-directed service, but because they knew that they had some data about kids but weren't complying with COPPA, which requires that you get verifiable parental consent before you use that data in any way other than for internal controls. So, so don't be an ostrich is probably one of the best takeaways that we can give here. But there's one other thing I'd say for those of you who are looking at some of the cross-device tracking and the extent to which you're relying on some of the self-regulatory regimes that are out there, the DAA, the NAI, and whatnot. I'm sure many of you are members of those groups. My understanding is that those self-reg codes, and I'm happy to see them. I believe self-reg codes are helpful, but they don't yet cover some very important issues like cross-device tracking. And I'm deeply focused on encouraging, you know, those entities to build into their codes some appropriate best practices around cross-device tracking, because it's not there yet. The other thing that we're seeing is that some of the codes don't really dive appropriately into health information in all the ways in which health information is flowing now through ad networks and advertisers and whatnot. So one of the codes talks about health information broadly, another just talks about medical information that comes like from a doctor's file. That's too narrow. And we really need to be thinking about health information in a much more broad way. So, you know, to the extent that you're working with the self-reg organizations, you know, and if you want to sort of make those self-reg codes meaningful, you know, after another month or two, it's going to get to the point where we're going to start to say, gee, you know, what do these things mean anymore, because they're so far behind where you all are in terms of the data tracking and the data collection and the data use that you're engaged in.
Mm-hmm. Right. So one of the things you said earlier, Commissioner Brill, was about how much data is collected. Some of the things that certainly relates to the kind of the quandary that I think the industry is in overall is if you knew what was relevant, you would only likely collect it.
Right.
And what is relevant tomorrow, if we could project that going forward, we probably would be in different businesses or doing something really different, especially with the rapidity of change that's going on, where what is relevant or needed today, 6 months from now, let alone 2 years from now, let alone 5 years from now, who knows? So how does the business really deal with the reality of not knowing what is going to be most important and most relevant, and should there be restrictions or self-restrictions in terms of what you collect or how much you collect?
So this is an issue that doesn't just apply to the ad sector, right? I mean, in the health research field, or people who want to use wearables to collect a lot of personalized information about us in terms of heartbeat and gait and things like that, to try to figure out who's going to be sick in the future. I mean, tremendous potential benefits in the health, what I call the health vertical as well, but still, we do have concerns about the collect it all now, we'll figure it out later approach. As I mentioned before, you've got the security issue front and center. Unless you're engaged in robust de-identification, but frankly, some of what you need as advertisers is you need to have linkable information so you can follow that individual. So the de-identification pitch I gave you a moment ago, you all were, to the extent you were listening, are thinking like, I can't do that. It's not going to work. So I get that. So let's, I want you to de-identify to the extent that you can, but if you can't do what we were just talking about because you have to have linkable information, then I think what we need to be thinking about is, again, providing much clearer upfront information to consumers just in time, whether it's coming from the source of your information, the retailers, the offline guys who you're getting information from. Consumers, individuals need to start understanding and want to start understanding where all this information is coming from. And it's the collectors of this information who aggregate it into profiles who we have said have a responsibility, not necessarily yet a legal responsibility, but a best practice responsibility to ensure that the sources you're getting information from, as well as those folks who are using it, whether it's you or your clients, are being really clear about where this data is coming from and giving consumers choices about it, especially when we're talking about sensitive information. So one of the buzzwords that's going around in Washington and other privacy circles is use-based frameworks. Let's just talk about use. Let's not worry about collection. That goes directly to your point. Why can't we just collect it all? And then we'll have a framework that says, well, we'll collect it all, but we'll just, when we get ready to use it, we'll just be careful that we use this data in an appropriate way. In a report that we just issued last week on the Internet of Things, which I hope we'll have time to talk about in a minute, what we said about the use-based frameworks is they're good. We like them. We think it's very good for companies, whether they're data brokers, whether they're ad networks, whether they're individual companies collecting a lot of data, or researchers or whatever. It's good to be thinking about how you're going to use the data. But from my perspective and from the FTC's perspective, they're necessary, but they're not sufficient. They're good to have in place because any kind of accountability mechanism is always a good thing. But at the end of the day, a use-based framework, unless it's developed through legislation or it's developed through a wide process where lots of people can participate in what are good uses and what are bad uses, what's appropriate, what isn't appropriate, it really comes down to just the company sort of saying, trust us, we'll do this the right way. And that leads to a couple of problems. Number one, it doesn't engender trust because of the lack of sunshine into the process. People don't know what's going on. And mistakes, if you look at all of our cases, mistakes are often made in terms of these kind of calls. So it needs to be a public process. In the absence of a public process, a public discussion about what the appropriate uses are, it's not going to do the job of building trust into the ecosystem. So great to have them, but unless we have a legislative use-based framework or a process where a wide number of stakeholders are involved to help develop the framework, it's really not going to do the trick that we're talking about.
Okay. So you mentioned the Internet of Things
Right.
And the report that the FTC just issued, and from the industry's perspective, since we fundamentally, I think in this room, are not necessarily, we're not CES, we're not the product innovators who are then developing the next refrigerator, toothbrush, pen, egg holder, or whatever it may be, but we will be involved in that process by the recipients and use of this data, which is going to be coming in from multiple sources that, to be frank, at least in the media world, we're beginning to understand as to how and what's being collected. In that world, it is truly, using the reference, Wild West in terms of where's it coming from, how's it coming from, what's it going to be. And could you speak to the Internet of Things from the FTC's perspective?
Yeah, I mean, we are, right now, it's estimated that there are more sensors collecting personal information than there are laptops and computers and whatnot. I mean, something like 20 billion of them. And by 2020, it's going to be like 50 billion. I mean, this is going to be a world where there will be sensors everywhere, in light bulbs, you know, as you said, in pens, in shoes, in not just health monitors, but in actual objects. And the information that will be collected will be deeply personal, because it'll all be about where we're moving, where we're going, what's happening in our bodies on a day-to-day basis, when we're home, when we're not home, when our kids are home, when they're not home, where we're driving, and how long we stay at a place. I mean, deeply personal information. And at the same time, Eric Schmidt just said, I think this was at Davos, but it was within the last couple of weeks, the other phenomenon not only will be that there will be these ubiquitous sensors, but the internet will disappear from most consumers' perspective, because all devices will be connected. It will just be the way things work. We won't be thinking in 5 or 10 years about connecting anymore, because things will automatically be connected. So this raises some really interesting challenges for how you provide notice to consumers about the data collection and the use that you're involved in when you're dealing with objects that don't have an interface, that consumers might not be thinking about, are they connected, are they not connected? So how do you do this? So one of the things that we talked about in the Internet of Things report was, again, being much more creative about how we provide information to consumers with respect to this deeply personal information that's going to be collected. When it's out of context, it's not what the consumer's expecting is going to happen with that device, with this pen, if it's a connected pen. But when that information goes to an advertiser or an ad network, that's when consumers need to be given information in an immersive, creative way. We talk about portals, creating portals that consumers can go to. We talk about using command centers. I think I might have mentioned that, you know, that are going to be controlling the home. Great place to tell them also what's happening with their data. Now, at the same time that we talk about these privacy issues, giving consumers effective notice and choice when it's an out-of-context use, particularly out-of-context, I should say, collection or use, and particularly when it's sensitive information. The other thing that the Internet of Things really raises is the security issues, front and center. Hewlett-Packard did a study, I think it was about a year ago, maybe 18 months at this point. 90% of connected devices are collecting personal information. 70% of them are sending that information out over networks in an unencrypted form. I mean, those numbers are staggering to someone like me who does law enforcement. And, you know, on the civil side, we don't put anyone in jail, but we do law enforcement with respect to data security. So what we have are a whole lot of companies, the entities that you may be getting information from, who are used to manufacturing dishwashers and cupboards and things like that. They're great manufacturers, and they'll do really well in the connected space, but they're not necessarily thinking about security in the way that some of the old line tech firms have been doing for so long. So we have to really evangelize this message that security is deeply important in the Internet of Things. And it's not just about data, it's also about device functionality. Think about having a pacemaker implanted or driving a connected car. Someone hacks into the pacemaker, they can turn it off. Pretty serious device functionality issue. Or they can cause the brakes on your connected car, your driverless car, to stop functioning. Now, these are all actually experiments that took place. One took place 7 years ago, the pacemaker experiment, and the driverless car experiment took place much more recently, within the last couple of years. So these are real potential problems, if that isn't an oxymoron, real potential problems. I mean, they are real issues that those who are engaged in this world of connected devices absolutely need to be thinking about. It's not just about the data, it's also about device functionality. But if you guys, for the advertisers and the ad networks who are all collecting information completely out of context from the consumer's perspective, for you, it's probably a little bit more about the collection of the data than it is about the device functionality. But if you want to see what we've said about security of this information, I highly recommend the business blog that we put out. We do, again, lots and lots of educational features on our website. But accompanying the Internet of Things report, which I think is actually pretty readable, it's about maybe 40, 50 pages. It's got a pretty good executive summary, but it's also pretty readable in and of itself. But what we did is we also put out a blog so people could see specifically what we think they should do with respect to security for connected devices. It's like a 1, 2, 3, you know, what should companies be looking at? So I recommend that to everybody.
Great, thank you. It's also interesting when you think about this as well, is the shifting of the responsibility. I mean, the basics of our concept is basically simple, which is to give consumers information so that they can make decisions, informed decisions as to what they do or don't want to do, and give them a certain level of control. That's historically been at the device level, and now, in fact, those devices don't do it. Where does it happen?
Right.
And it may be ultimately it's going to be coming on our level in some way, or we'll have involvement in that in some way.
That's true. I mean, you think about connected devices, they're not going to have interfaces.
They're not.
Right? Or they're going to have, you know, some portal that the consumer's going to go to, hopefully. The other problem is many of these devices will be basically disposable, right? They'll be connected, they'll be collecting information, but it will, the cost benefit for the manufacturer to push through a patch when there is a security vulnerability will just be ridiculous. I mean, because it's a disposable device, they're not going to push through patches or notify consumers about how to download a patch, and you're going to have these huge vulnerabilities out there. I mean, it just really raises a whole host of issues that we as a society, you as data collectors, you as data users, and all the manufacturers that you're going to be getting the data from, really need to be thinking pretty deeply about.
So we only have a few minutes left, but so I'll have you look, can you look into your crystal ball?
Sure.
See forward, give your perspectives on what you see happening, maybe either on the legislative front with this new spirit of cooperation in Washington, joke, and just what you see and think about going forward, so maybe some predictions.
Sure. So President Obama came to the FTC about 2.5 weeks ago to give a big speech on privacy and data security, and I don't know how many of you followed that or heard about that, but it was really pretty thrilling to us. You know, it was the first time a president had been to the Federal Trade Commission since FDR laid the cornerstone of our building. And the president made a pretty funny joke about it. He said, you'd think that one president would have just wandered in here by mistake, right? But none had. So both in that speech, and then he picked it up in the State of the Union address, but in a more condensed form because he didn't want to spend that much time on it. The president is calling for 3 pieces of legislation. One is data breach notification coupled with data security legislation. The second is a student privacy bill of rights. So, student privacy law. So to the extent any of you are involved in the ed tech space or advertising that's associated with ed tech, you should really watch that space and drill down a little bit into what's going on there. And then the third is the Consumer Privacy Bill of Rights, which is something that's been around now since the Obama administration came in, but they've been thinking deeply about how to develop a Consumer Privacy Bill of Rights in the context of the burgeoning Internet of Things. So that's one of the reasons why that sort of went back to the drawing board for a little while, and I think is going to be coming out soon. So if I had to predict, you know, some people think the data security breach notification legislation probably has the most oomph behind it right now, because there have been bills that have been drafted in the past, there have been hearings already. But you know, it's funny, even though we've had some incredibly large breaches over the past year, And even though security seems to be growing in importance, like just think about Sony, just, let alone the JP Morgans and Targets and Home Depots of the world. There have been just some rocks that have met, a hard place, right? That, or whatever that saying is. There just have been some arguments that have not been resolved thus far with respect to data security and data breach notification, and they largely revolve around preemption. Mm-hmm. I think it may happen this year, but if I have to predict, part of me actually thinks that the student privacy bill might go through more quickly because it's kids, right? It's students, and everybody's a parent. Most people are parents. Everybody was a kid at some point, and people really want the ed tech space to flourish. California already has a law in place, and what the president has called for is really just building that so it's nationwide. So on some level, that may end up being the easier lift at the end of the day. The Future Privacy Forum has a self-reg privacy promise for those in the ed tech space, and after the president called for more people to sign on to it, after he came to the FTC and gave his talk, like 75 more entities signed up for it. So it's really, I think, kind of taking off. So my prediction is student privacy may get, data security may get out of the gate first, and data breach notification may get out of the gate first. There already was a hearing last week. There are going to be more hearings on it. But it might be the tortoise, and the hare, and it might be that student privacy is the tortoise that makes it over the finish line first.
Great. Well, thank you very much, the audience, and thank you, Commissioner Brill, for your talk.
Sure, thank you.
Would you like to take a question?
Sure, I'm happy to take questions, absolutely. If you guys have time, absolutely.
One question, anybody?
There's a mic right coming right towards you, if you want it.
Hello? So I want to take a clarification on one point, if I could. You said if you don't use some data to get rid of it?
I'm sorry, I'm having...
Sorry. I wanted to get clarification on something.
Yes.
You mentioned that if you're not using data to just get rid of it.
Yes.
Okay. It reminded me of when email first became a thing. And there were a lot of directives from CE level powers that be that said, when your mailbox reaches a certain level, you delete everything. And we found out after time that because they were deleting so much and they couldn't afford the space, that companies were getting in trouble because they were, I mean, I'm not sure what technically it became, but it was, in a way, they were destroying evidence. So if you feel that we should get rid of data, do you have any opinions on a safe way to do that?
Do I have any what?
Opinions on a safe way to do that? Or, I mean, do you find any parallels between the situations?
I don't find any parallels between those situations at all. I mean, so I've done law enforcement for a long time, and if you start getting rid of emails because you receive a CID or a subpoena, and it's not in compliance with your normal data destruction protocols, then yeah, you're going to get in trouble, or potentially could get in trouble. But if you have a normal sort of system for deleting emails, we do at the FTC. We delete emails because of space issues. You're likely not to get in trouble. But I really don't see the parallel because that's sort of a law enforcement issue. What we're talking about with respect to data, and what I'm trying to encourage companies to do, is to think deeply about what is the use that you're going to make of this data. And if you're simply collecting it because you think at some point in the future it may be worthwhile, it's the gold that you all want, and the nugget, you don't know what the shape is or anything like that, but you're sure there'll be a nugget down the road. There are risks associated with that. Not law enforcement risks, but the risks are data security, and the risks are misuse, whether it's within your own company or whether it's through someone hacking in, or whether it's someone using the data, not sort of an employee hacking into the system, but using it in a way that turns out to actually be harmful to your company's reputation or your client's reputation, because you're using it in ways that are unfair to consumers, maybe target them for some of the sensitive issues that I talked about, and you've never given consumers notice or any kind of robust, just-in-time information about what's going on. I mean, how do you avoid being, a headline, with a byline from Natasha Singer or, Julia Angwin or Liza Dwoskin or any of the other investigative reporters who are looking deeply at your industry? The way you do that is to follow the best practices that I'm talking about. Stay far away from the law enforcement concerns that I've raised about engaging in unfair and deceptive practices, not the law enforcement issues you've raised, but engaging in unfair and deceptive practices, and really focus on best practices around big data use. And that means thinking deeply about, do you really need this? Because if you don't, there are risks to holding on to it.
Because part of the issue is, in the end, this is something Commissioner Brill is dealing with on an international focus, which is the concept of sort of like just, it's raining, let's just collect the water that comes in. It's just free reign, right? The data's coming in. If I'm smart enough to figure it out, why don't I just collect it? In other places around the world, and in fact there's some views in the US about this as well, is to say, it's not free reign. It's my property. What are you taking? How dare you collect it? So there's a little bit of that, which to us may not seem to be relevant, but if there are these breaches and bad situations that occur, then someone's going to say, wait a minute, why did they collect it, and should they be collecting it? Right now, it's a little bit of saying, if we're smart about what we do in this world that's very fast changing, we just have to think about the consequences of what we're doing as part of it, because that rainwater that we've collected potentially can be very big and very dangerous. But then people can really then come in and then do create the legislation that says, before you collect this, like you have to do in certain particular segments, in specific, you need to get someone's affirmative consent to do that.
Yeah, and to pick up on that, to pick up on the legislative point really quickly, right? If best practices aren't engaged in, and consumers are really being segmented based on their health conditions and advertised to in this way, you're going to start to hear more and more calls for legislation in this space. I have already called for data broker legislation. I think that it would be important for consumers to be able to suppress information if it's used for marketing purposes. Just say, look, I don't want to be marketed to based on you thinking I'm a gardener, or you thinking I have AIDS, or you thinking I'm addicted to whatever. I just don't want to be marketed to on that basis. To give the consumer that choice. Or to correct information if it's being used for more substantive purposes that might not quite reach FCRA, but the Fair Credit Reporting Act, but become awfully close to it. So to the extent that the industry doesn't sort of abide by some of these best practices, I think what you're going to hear are more and more people like me saying, yeah, we really do need to bring this sector under control.
Mm-hmm.
Thanks. Commissioner.
Thanks. On that happy note.
Thank you for keeping us safe as consumers and for your guidance today.
Sure.
It was absolutely valuable.
Sure, great.
So a quick wrap up. Thanks to all of our attendees who are still here, to our panelists, to our speakers. Thought it was a great day. I'd like to thank our sponsors, ComScore, Rocket Fuel, and J. Walter Thompson for providing us this terrific space. I want to thank our media partners, the 4A media partners. I want to thank the 4A's team who helped execute the program, Troy Stalwart, Brenda Major, Michael Boyle, Donovan Andrews, Georgia Sicard, Joyce Glenn, and Dick O'Brien, and the 4A's marketing team led by Allison Fahey and Jules Shapiro. Did a lot to help drive it. Thanks to everybody.